Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There are secrets buried so deep that even the gods forget them. Secrets that could have saved everything, could have lifted humanity out of the darkness and into an age of light and reason that would have made the greatest civilizations in galactic history look like children playing with stones. And there was one secret, one single, impossibly ambitious project that the Emperor of mankind held closer to his chest than any other. Closer than the truth about the Primarchs. Closer than the nature of chaos itself. Closer than the bargains he made on Molech, or the debts he owed to powers older than the stars. This was the Webway project, the great work, the single most important undertaking in the entire history of the human species, and yet it was something that almost nobody in the Imperium ever knew existed. Not the Primarchs, or not the generals, not the billions upon billions of soldiers fighting and dying across 1,000,000 worlds in the Emperor's name. They bled for a future they could not even imagine, a future that was being quietly assembled in laboratories buried beneath the Himalayan mountains, behind doors sealed with psychic wards strong enough to keep out the whispers of gods. And it failed. It failed not because it was impossible, not because the science was wrong or the ambition was too great. It failed because of love, in a way, because a son tried to warn his father of a terrible danger, and in doing so, destroyed the very thing that might have saved them both. It failed because the universe has a sense of irony so cruel that it borders on malice, and because the forces of chaos understood, perhaps better than the Emperor himself, to talk about the most secret project and to talk about the most secret project in all of Warhammer 40,000. We are going to talk about the Terran Webway and the dream that died beneath the Imperial Palace and the war that no one remembers fighting and the price that humanity is still paying 10,000 years later for one moment of cosmic bad luck. This is the story of everything that could have been and everything that was lost. Let us begin at the very beginning, long before humanity ever looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. Long before the Emperor walked the earth in his many guises. Long before the first human being drew breath on the plains of ancient Terra. Because to understand the Webway project, you first need to understand the Webway itself. And to understand the Webway, you need to go back further than you might think. Much, much further. Imagine a time before time had meaning. Imagine a galaxy that was young and raw and burning with the energy of creation itself. The stars were new. The planets were still cooling from the fires of their formation. And somewhere in that primordial chaos, a species rose to prominence that would shape the destiny of every living thing for millions of years to come. They were called the Old Ones, and they were old even when the galaxy was young. We do not know what they looked like. We do not know the name they gave themselves in whatever language they spoke. We know almost nothing about their culture, their beliefs, their hopes or their fears. What we do know is that they were brilliant beyond anything that any species since has been able to match. They understood the fundamental forces of reality the way you or I understand how to breathe. They manipulated the fabric of existence with the casual confidence of a master painter working with a familiar brush. And among their greatest achievements, perhaps the single most impressive feat of engineering in the entire history of the Milky Way galaxy, was the creation of the Webway. Think about what the Webway actually is for a moment. Not in abstract lore terms, but in terms of what it represents as a piece of technology. The Old Ones looked at the galaxy with its 100 billion stars and its vast, impossible distances, and they said, "We can do better." They looked at the warp, yet that roiling ocean of psychic energy that existed alongside the material universe, like a dark reflection in a broken mirror, and instead of being afraid of it, instead of avoiding it the way any sensible species might, they decided to use it, but not by sailing through it, the way humanity would later attempt with warp drives and Geller fields and navigators squinting into the abyss. No. The Old Ones did something far more elegant. They carved out a space between spaces. They took the boundary layer that existed between the material universe and the warp, that impossibly thin membrane where reality met unreality, and they hollowed it out. They expanded it. They reinforced it with materials that were resistant to psychic energy, materials that we still cannot identify or replicate even in the 41st millennium. And within that hollowed-out space, they built tunnels, corridors, highways, an entire network of passages that connected distant points in the galaxy the way veins and arteries connect the organs of a living body. The Webway, a labyrinth dimension, a maze of glowing tunnels that existed neither in the material universe nor in the warp, but in the space between the two, a place where you could travel from one end of the galaxy to the other in the time it took to walk from one room to the next, a place where the horrifying entities that dwelt in the warp could not reach you because the psychically resistant walls of the tunnels kept them at bay, a place that was, in every meaningful sense, the single greatest transportation network ever devised by any intelligence in the history of creation. And the old ones built it casually, as part of their daily operations, the way we build roads. Let that sink in for a moment, because that is the scale of what we are talking about. The Webway is not some minor piece of technology. It is not a clever trick or a useful tool. It is a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between dimensions, a feat of engineering so profound that it borders on the divine. Millions of years after it was built, species that consider themselves advanced beyond measure still cannot figure out how it works, let alone reproduce it. The Elder, who inherited it from the Old Ones and used it for millennia, never fully understood its deepest secrets. And when the Emperor of Mankind, the most powerful psyker who had ever lived, tried to create his own version of it, he could only manage a pale imitation that required his constant personal attention to maintain. That is what the Webway is. That is the thing that the Emperor wanted for humanity. And now you understand why he wanted it so badly that he was willing to sacrifice almost everything else to get it. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can talk about the Emperor's grand ambition, we need to understand how the Webway changed hands, how it passed from the Old Ones to the Elder, and how, in the long millennia that followed, it became both the greatest treasure in the galaxy and the most dangerous trap. The Old Ones did not build the Webway for themselves alone. They were creators by nature, shapers of life and destiny. They looked at the raw material of the galaxy, the simple organisms crawling on the surfaces of 1,000 worlds, and they saw potential. They uplifted species. They guided evolution. They created races that would serve as their allies, their students, their inheritors. And among the most important of these created races were the Elder. The Elder were, in many ways, the Old Ones' finest achievement. They were psychically gifted to an extraordinary degree, their minds burning with warp energy that the Old Ones had carefully cultivated over generations of selective guidance. They were long-lived, intelligent, and possessed of a sensitivity to the currents of the Imperium that no other species could match. The Old Ones raised them, taught them, and when the time came, they shared with them the secrets of the Webway. This was not a gift given lightly. The Webway was the Old Ones' greatest weapon, as much as it was their greatest tool. Most during the devastating conflict that would come to be known as the War in Heaven, when the Old Ones fought against the terrible alliance of the Necrontyr and their star-devouring masters, the Satan, the Webway was their primary strategic advantage. It allowed them to move armies across the galaxy in an instant, striking where the enemy least expected it, retreating before the slow-moving Necron legions could bring their terrible weapons to bear. Without the Webway, the Old Ones would have been crushed by the sheer mechanical might of the Necrons and the cosmic power of the Satan long before they could mount any kind of defense. But the War in Heaven was a catastrophe beyond imagining, even for beings as powerful as the Old Ones. The conflict raged for millions of years. Entire star systems were annihilated. Weapons were deployed that rewrote the laws of physics in localized areas. creating zones of permanent impossibility that persist to this day. The Necrons, transformed into undying metal warriors by the biotransference that their Citan masters had inflicted upon them, breached the Webway itself using devices called dolmen gates, crude but effective tools that punched holes in the Webway's walls and allowed the soulless legions to pour into its tunnels. The Old Ones fought desperately. In their desperation, they created more warrior races, bred more species with stronger connections to the warp, hoping to overwhelm the Necrons with psychic power that their soulless forms could not withstand. Among these creations were the Krork, primitive ancestors of the Orcs, and possibly even the earliest ancestors of humanity itself. But the war had a terrible side effect. All that psychic energy being thrown around, all those newly created species blazing with warp power, all that suffering and death and rage and terror, it fed something in the warp. It gave shape and strength to entities that had been formless before. It helped birth the very first true demons. And in the end, the Old Ones fell. Not to the Necrons alone, but to a combination of enemies that attacked them from every direction. The Citan devoured them. The demons, newly empowered by the psychic turmoil of the war, invaded through the tears in reality that the fighting had created. Even the enslavers, parasitic warp entities that possessed psychers and used their bodies as gateways, joined the assault. The Old Ones were overwhelmed, scattered, and ultimately destroyed. Their civilization crumbled. Their knowledge was lost. Their works fell into disrepair. But the Webway survived. It was too vast, too deeply embedded in the fabric of reality to be easily destroyed. Damaged, yes. Broken in places, corrupted in others. But it endured. And as the dust of the war in heaven settled, and the Necrons retreated into their tomb worlds for their great sleep, and the Citan were shattered and imprisoned by the very servants they had created, the Eldar inherited what remained, and for a while, a very long while, they used it magnificently. The Eldar Empire that arose in the wake of the war in heaven was arguably the most powerful civilization the galaxy had ever seen, second only to the Old Ones themselves. And the Webway was the foundation upon which that empire was built. The Eldar mastered its secrets with a thoroughness that the Old Ones might have admired. They learned to navigate its labyrinthine passages, to maintain its ancient infrastructure, to build new extensions and modifications to the existing network. They created portal cities within the Webway itself, places where their people could live and work and create in spaces that existed outside of normal reality. The Eldar's mastery of the Webway went far beyond simple navigation. They understood its psychic architecture at a level that no other species has achieved before or since. Their bone singers, those specialist artisans who could shape wraithbone through psychic song, developed techniques for repairing damaged sections of the Webway, using the same psychically resonant material that the Old Ones had originally employed. While the Eldar could not perfectly replicate the Old Ones' technology, they could create passable imitations, patches, and extensions that were functionally similar to the original construction. Their seers could read the currents of psychic energy that flowed through the Webway's structure, predicting instabilities before they occurred and taking corrective action. Their rangers, those solitary warriors who walked the lonely paths between craftworlds, mapped new routes through the labyrinth dimension with a thoroughness and courage that earned them respect across all of Eldar society. The Webway was not just a tool for the Eldar, it was part of their identity, woven into their culture and their spirituality in ways that went far deeper than mere utility. For millions of years, the Eldar Empire flourished. It was a civilization of staggering beauty and horrifying power, capable of feats that made the achievements of every other species in the galaxy look primitive by comparison. Their art was sublime. Their science was godlike. Their military might was unchallenged. They had no enemies worth the name, no rivals that could threaten their dominance. The galaxy was theirs, and they knew it. And that knowledge, That absolute certainty of their own supremacy was what destroyed them. Because when you have everything, when every desire is satisfied and every challenge conquered, when there is nothing left to strive for and nothing left to fear, what do? You get bored. And when the most psychically powerful species in the galaxy gets bored, the consequences are cosmic in scale. The greatest of these portal cities was Commorragh. Originally established around the 18th millennium by human reckoning as the primary nodal port of the Eldar Webway, Commorragh was a place of breathtaking ambition. It was built at a crucial junction point in the Webway's network, a location from which you could reach virtually any part of the galaxy through the interconnected web of tunnels and passages. Because of this strategic importance, Commorragh was considered too valuable to be controlled by any single faction of the Eldar Empire. It was granted autonomy, allowed to govern itself outside the jurisdiction of the great councils that directed Eldar civilization. This would prove to be a fateful decision, because Commorragh's autonomy attracted a certain kind of Eldar, the ones who wanted to pursue their pleasures without oversight, and the ones who found the traditions and restraints of mainstream Eldar society to be inconvenient. The pleasure cults that were slowly, insidiously growing within Eldar civilization found in Commorragh a place where they could indulge their increasingly extreme appetites without interference. Over thousands of years, these cults grew in power and influence, their practices becoming more depraved with each passing generation. They retreated further and further into the Webway, establishing their own sub-realms powered by stolen suns. Entire star systems plunged into eternal darkness so that the Eldar could have light in their private dimensional pockets. The Webway, that masterpiece of the Old One's engineering, was being slowly transformed from a highway into a hiding place, from a tool of civilization into a refuge for decadence. And the darkness that was growing in those hidden corners of the Webway was feeding something terrible in the depths of the warp, something that was slowly, agonizingly slowly, taking shape. But that is a story for another time. The fall of the Eldar, the birth of Slaanesh, the shattering of their civilization, and the catastrophic damage it inflicted on the Webway. These are enormous subjects in their own right, and we will touch on them only as they relate to our main story. What matters for our purposes is this. By the time the Emperor of Mankind began his great work of unification on Terra, the Webway still existed, damaged, fractured, dangerous, haunted by demons in its broken sections and infested by the Dark Eldar in others, but still functional, still connecting distant points of the galaxy. For a very, very long time. But before we turn to the Emperor's grand design, let us linger a little longer in the Webway itself. Because understanding its nature, truly grasping what it is and how it works, is essential to appreciating both the brilliance and the hubris of what the Emperor attempted. The Webway is often described as a labyrinth, and that word is apt, but it does not quite capture the full strangeness of the thing. Imagine a network of tunnels that exist between two realities, like the space between the walls of a house. On one side is the material universe, the stars, the planets, the cold vacuum of space, everything you can see and touch and measure. And on the other side is the warp, the realm of emotion and thought made manifest, a churning ocean of psychic energy where the laws of physics are suggestions at best and cruel jokes at worst. The Webway sits between these two realms, partitioned off from both, belonging to neither. The tunnels themselves are not uniform. Some are as narrow as a single corridor, barely wide enough for a person to walk through. Others are vast arterial passages, highways of interdimensional space, large enough for entire fleets of spacecraft to pass through without crowding. Some sections are stable, their walls thick and strong, resistant to the pressures of the warp that constantly push against them from the outside. Others are fragile, damaged by age or conflict, yet their walls thin enough that the predatory entities of the Imperium can sometimes sense what lies on the other side and scratch at the barrier like rats behind plaster. The architecture of the Webway is not purely mechanical. It is psychic in nature, or perhaps more accurately, it is the product of a technology so advanced that the distinction between the physical and the psychic becomes meaningless. The material the old ones used to construct the tunnels generates its own psychic shielding, a passive defense that requires no active maintenance or power source. This is why the original sections of the Webway have survived for millions of years, despite the constant assault of warp energy. They are self-sustaining, self-healing, almost alive in the way they respond to threats and maintain their structural integrity. But there are places within the Webway where time flows differently. The Harlequins, those enigmatic warrior dancers who serve the Eldar god Tegarak and know the Webway's secrets better than anyone else alive, speak of remote locations where time flows backward or where it does not flow at all. These temporal anomalies are thought to be side effects of the Webway's construction, places where the boundary between dimensions is so thin that the normal rules of causality break down. The Harlequins navigate these zones with a casual expertise that speaks of millennia of practice. But for any other being, entering such a place would mean madness or death. There is even evidence that prolonged exposure to the Webway can affect the aging process. The Inquisitor, Bronislaw Chevak, but one of the few humans ever to spend an extended period within the Webway, reportedly had his body's aging reversed by several centuries during his decades-long journey through its corridors. The Webway's reality is more malleable than that of the material universe, but not as fluid as the warp, and this middle ground creates effects that neither realm alone would produce. And then there is the matter of what lives within the Webway. Even before the fall of the Eldar damaged its structure, the labyrinth dimension was not entirely safe. Predatory entities called Psychnuin, wasp-like creatures born of the warp's fringes, infested certain corridors. Other beings, stranger and less classifiable, lurked in the deeper passages where the light of the stolen suns did not reach. The Webway was a habitat, not just a highway, and like any habitat, now it had its own ecosystem of dangers. After the fall, the situation became dramatically worse. The cataclysmic psychic event that birthed Slanesh sent shockwaves through the Webway, rupturing its walls in countless places and allowing demons to flood into passages that had been safe for millions of years. Entire sections of the network became impassable, sealed off by the Eldar with psychic runes to prevent the corruption from spreading. Dead ends appeared where there had once been thoroughfares. Traps materialized in corridors that had been traveled safely for millennia. The Webway, once the safest and most efficient means of travel in the galaxy, became a dangerous place. A labyrinth in the truest sense of the word, where a wrong turn could lead to death or something far worse. The Eldar adapted, as they always do. At the craft world, Eldar learned to navigate the damaged network with the help of their seers, who could sense the currents of psychic energy that flowed through the Webway and identify safe paths through the broken landscape. The Harlequins, with their ancient knowledge and mysterious ways, continued to move through the deepest and most dangerous sections with an ease that the craft-world Eldar found both impressive and unsettling. And the Drukhari, those dark kin of the Eldar who had hidden in the Webway during the fall, thrived. Komorragh, their impossibly vast city-state, had survived the cataclysm largely intact, its location deep within the Webway's structure, providing a degree of protection from the worst of the psychic shockwaves. In the millennia that followed, the Drukhari expanded their domain aggressively, in absorbing neighboring sub-realms and port cities, building the great gates that connected their scattered territories, and growing into a civilization that was, in its own twisted way, as powerful as any in the galaxy. Komorragh deserves special attention in our story, because it represents something unique in the Webway. It is not just a city, it is a dimension unto itself, a collection of pocket realms and sub-dimensions, linked by portals and hidden pathways, stretching across the Webway's arteries like a virus spreading through the veins of a host organism. Its dimensions would be impossible to measure by conventional means. Its population is greater than that of whole star systems. Thousands of starships dock at its spires each day, bringing slaves and plunder from raids across the galaxy. But the sheer scale of Komarach is difficult to comprehend. It is not a city in any sense that a human mind can easily grasp. It is a sprawling empire of interconnected, dimensional pockets, each one large enough to contain a small planet, all of them linked together by portals and passages that make the Webway itself look simple by comparison. Entire districts of Komarach are larger than continents. The spires of the Cabals, those towering fortress palaces that serve as the homes and military bases of the Drukhari aristocracy, rise to heights that would dwarf the tallest mountains on any natural world. The arenas where slaves are forced to fight for the entertainment of their captors are large enough to hold populations equivalent to small cities. And beneath the visible city, and in the sublevels and hidden passages that ordinary Drukhari never visit, there are stranger things. Laboratories where homunculi, those grotesque artist surgeons who have mastered the science of flesh manipulation, conduct experiments that would make the most depraved human scientist recoil in horror. Oubliettes where prisoners have been kept alive for centuries, their suffering carefully maintained at precisely the level necessary to nourish their Drukhari captors' souls. Shrines to forgotten gods and abandoned philosophies. Relics of the ancient Eldar Empire preserved in the Webway's timeless depths. Komarach's existence within the Webway also means that it is uniquely vulnerable to the same threats that plagued the Emperor's project. The Drukhari have spent millennia building and maintaining psychic defenses around their city, using technologies and techniques inherited from the ancient Eldar to keep the demons at bay. But these defenses are not perfect, and the growth of the Great Rift has placed new and unprecedented strain on them. The disjunction of Komarach, triggered by the actions of Ivrain and the partial awakening of Inead, demonstrated just how fragile the Dark City's defenses truly are. When Cain's Gate, the Great Seal that kept the most dangerous section of the Webway separated from Komarach, nearly broke open, the entire city was plunged into a chaos that made its usual atmosphere of violence and cruelty look peaceful by comparison. The Necrons also have their own relationship with the Webway, and it is one that adds another layer of complexity to the Emperor's plans. During the War in Heaven, the Necrons had been unable to access the Webway because their soulless metallic bodies were incompatible with its psychic nature. The Webway was built by psychic beings, for psychic beings, and the Necrons, who had sacrificed their souls to the Satan in exchange for bodies of living metal, were psychically inert. They could no more enter the Webway naturally than a stone could swim. But the Necrons are nothing if not resourceful. After their great sleep, as their tomb worlds began to awaken across the galaxy, the Necrons developed a technology called dolmen gates. These devices, built using principles that remain poorly understood even by Imperial scientists, allow the Necrons to punch through the walls of the Webway from the outside, creating temporary access points that they can use for rapid transportation between their scattered territories. The dolmen gates are a crude solution compared to the elegant portals used by the Eldar, and they cause significant damage to the Webway's structure wherever they are deployed. Each dolmen gate creates a wound in the Webway's psychic walls, a breach that allows warp energy to seep into passages that were previously sealed. The Eldar, understandably, are furious about this. The Harlequins, in particular, view the dolmen gates as an abomination, a violation of the Old One's most sacred creation by the very species that helped destroy the Old Ones in the first place. The Drukhari power their city with stolen suns, entire stars that were physically transported from the material universe into the Webway during the height of the ancient Eldar Empire. These captive stars, called Ilmaya or Black Suns, burn in their own subrealms above Komarach, casting a perpetual crimson twilight over the Dark City. The star systems from which these suns were stolen were plunged into eternal darkness, their populations left to freeze and die in the void. But the Eldar who took them cared nothing for the suffering of lesser species. This is the Webway that the Emperor wanted to claim for humanity. Not the pristine, undamaged network of the Old One's era, but the broken, dangerous, demon-infested labyrinth of the post-fall galaxy. He was not deterred by the damage. He was not intimidated by the dangers. He looked at this shattered, interdimensional highway. Only he could rebuild it. Only he could rebuild it. Would carry humanity out of the darkness and into the light. That vision is what drove the Webway project. That is what the Emperor was willing to sacrifice everything for. Not just his own comfort, not just his freedom, not just the trust of his sons and the loyalty of his allies, but everything. Because the alternative, continuing to rely on the warp for travel and communication, was a path that led inevitably to destruction. The Emperor understood something that few others grasped. He understood that the relationship between humanity and the warp was not neutral. It was not a simple exchange of risks and rewards. It was parasitic. He and humanity was the host. Every time a human ship entered the warp, every time an astropath sent a psychic message, every time a psyker used their abilities, the chaos gods grew stronger. They fed on the psychic energy that humanity generated, grew fat on its fears and desires and ambitions, and they would never stop feeding. They would continue to grow, continue to corrupt, continue to devour, until there was nothing left. The Webway was the only way to break the cycle, the only way to sever the connection between humanity and the warp, without also severing humanity's ability to travel between the stars. It was, in the Emperor's view, not merely a good idea or a useful project. It was an existential necessity. Without it, humanity was doomed. Not immediately, perhaps. Not in a century or a millennium, but eventually, inevitably. The warp would consume them all. That is why the Emperor was willing to pay such a terrible price for the project. That is why he kept it so desperately secret. That is why he sacrificed his relationship with his sons, his presence in the Great Crusade, his ability to guide and protect the Imperium personally. Because he believed, with the absolute conviction of a being who had seen the future and understood its implications, that nothing else mattered. The Great Crusade was a means to an end. The Primarchs were tools designed for a purpose. The Space Marine legions were instruments of a plan that extended far beyond mere military conquest. Everything was in service to the Webway project, because the Webway project was the only thing that could save humanity from its own psychic nature. How long exactly, we cannot say with certainty. The Emperor's history stretches back tens of thousands of years, through so many identities and incarnations that even he may not remember them all perfectly. But we know that he understood the warp better than any human who had ever lived. We know that he had traveled to places and learned things that would have driven lesser minds to madness. And we know that at some point, perhaps during the dark age of technology, perhaps even earlier, he conceived of a plan so ambitious that it makes the Great Crusade itself look like a minor preliminary exercise. He would take the Webway from the Eldar, he would expand it, he would connect it to Terra, and he would use it to unite the human species in a way that had never been possible before, creating an empire that could communicate and travel instantaneously across the entire galaxy, but without ever touching the warp. No more navigators squinting into the abyss of the Imperium, risking their souls and the souls of everyone aboard their ships every time they made a jump. No more Geller fields struggling to hold back the howling madness of the warp. No more ships lost to warp storms, consumed by demons, or spat out centuries away from their intended destination. No more chaos. That was the dream. That was the great work. And it was, without question, the most important thing the Emperor had ever attempted. More important than the Primarch project. More important than the Space Marine legions. More important than the Great Crusade. All of those things were means to an end, steps along a path that led to one destination, a humanity united through the Webway, severed from the warp forever. evolving into a fully psychic species under the Emperor's guidance, ascending to a level of power and sophistication that would make even the ancient Eldar Empire look primitive by comparison. Everything else was just preparation, and that is why the Emperor kept it secret. That is why he told almost no one, because the stakes were so impossibly high that he could not risk any interference, not from the Eldar, who would surely try to stop him if they learned of his plans, not from the Chaos Gods, who would be destroyed by the project's success, and not from certain factions within his own Imperium, who had very good reasons of their own to want the project to fail. So let us talk about the discovery. Let us talk about the moment when the Emperor found the key to humanity's salvation, buried beneath the sands of an ancient desert. Let us talk about the Golden Throne. The story begins on Terra during the Unification Wars. This was the period when the Emperor emerged from his millennia of hiding and began the long, bloody process of conquering Earth, uniting its fractured nations and techno-barbarian empires under a single banner. It was a time of tremendous violence and upheaval, but also a time of discovery, because Terra in this era was littered with relics of the dark age of technology, buried beneath the rubble of civilizations that had risen and fallen during the long nightmare of the Age of Strife. Deep beneath an immense and inhospitable desert on the continent of Asia, the Emperor found something extraordinary. The accounts vary on the exact nature of the discovery. Some sources suggest he found a pre-existing Webway portal, and a gate that the old ones, or perhaps even some earlier, unknown species, had created millions of years ago. Others suggest he found only the core of a device, a piece of technology so advanced that even the Emperor could not determine with certainty whether it was of human origin, alien manufacture, or something else entirely. When asked directly about its provenance by custodian Diocletian Koros, millennia later, the Emperor was characteristically evasive. He said that he either improved upon technology from the dark age of technology, or possibly came up with the idea entirely on his own. He refused to give a definitive answer. What we do know is that this device, this core, became the foundation upon which the Golden Throne was built, and the Golden Throne, in turn, it became the foundation upon which the entire Webway project was constructed. Think about that for a moment. The single most important piece of technology in the entire Imperium of man. The device that sustains the Emperor's life and projects the Astronomicon beacon that makes warp travel possible. The device that is literally the only thing standing between Terra and a catastrophic demonic invasion was not originally designed for any of those purposes. It was designed to be a door, a gateway into the Webway. The life support function, the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon, all of those were improvised later, desperate adaptations made necessary by the failure of its original purpose. The Golden Throne was a key to a door between dimensions, and the Emperor spent centuries preparing to turn that key. The construction and modification of the Golden Throne was an undertaking of staggering complexity. The Emperor directed tens of thousands of Mechanicum tech priests to work on the device over a period of several hundred years, even as the Great Crusade raged across the galaxy. The throne took the form of a massive mechanized chair constructed from an unknown type of psychically reactive gold-colored alloy. It was suspended over a pair of enormous doors made of the same golden material. Doors that were large enough for a Warhound Scout Titan to walk through standing upright. Think about that scale. Doors wide enough and tall enough for a god machine of war to stride through without ducking. That gives you some sense of the sheer physical magnitude of what the Emperor was building. Yes, the chair itself was connected to the portal by vast bundles of cables, wires and conduits. The whole apparatus was installed in a hall so enormous that it could have housed 6 fully equipped Space Marine companies. Hundreds of red-robed technicians and laborers worked in this subterranean laboratory at any given time, toiling away in the depths of what would come to be known as the Imperial Dungeon, the vast underground complex beneath the Imperial Palace. But the mechanical construction was only half the challenge. The other half was psychic. The original Webway had been built by the old ones from materials that were naturally resistant to psychic energy. This was crucial, because the Webway existed in the space between the material universe and the warp.
Honestly, this is the part of the lore that gets me every single time. Out of everything in Warhammer 40K, the Webway project is the one story that actually makes me feel something close to genuine sadness. Not because of the battles or the body count, but because it is the one moment where you can see what the setting could have been. A future where humanity actually had a chance. No demons, no whispering through the warp during every voyage, no sacrificing thousands of psychers just to keep the lights on. Just a clean, safe road between the stars built by a father who was trying, in his own deeply flawed and secretive way, to protect his children from a darkness they didn't even know existed. And Magnus, man, Magnus is the one that breaks my heart, because he was not trying to betray anyone. He loved his father. He wanted to help. He just didn't know what he was breaking when he reached out. That's not a villain's story, that's a tragedy. And I think this is why this particular corner of the lore resonates with so many people. Because it's not grimdark for the sake of being grimdark. It is grimdark because something genuinely beautiful was lost. And everyone involved was trying to do the right thing. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's get back to the story.
Without psychic shielding, as the tunnels of the Webway would have been vulnerable to intrusion by the entities of the Imperium, the demons, the predators, the formless horrors that swam through the warp like sharks through dark water. The Old One's materials kept these threats at bay naturally, passively, without requiring any active effort or maintenance. Humanity did not possess the technology to replicate these materials. The Emperor understood them, or at least understood their function, but he could not reproduce them. This was a critical limitation, because it meant that any new sections of Webway that humanity built, any extensions or modifications to the existing network, would not have the passive psychic shielding that the original tunnels possessed. They would be vulnerable to demonic intrusion. Chit would project his own immense psychic power into the new human-built sections of the Webway, creating a barrier that would keep the demons at bay through sheer force of will. It was an elegant solution in theory, but it had a devastating practical consequence. It required the Emperor to remain on the Golden Throne continuously, maintaining the psychic shield at all times. This was why the Emperor left the Great Crusade. This was why he returned to Terra after the victory at Ullanor and appointed Horus as War Master. Not because he was tired of fighting, not because he was bored with conquest, not because he did not trust his sons to carry on the work. But he left because the Webway project had reached a critical phase that required his constant personal attention. The new tunnels that the Mechanicum was building needed his psychic protection every moment of every day, and he could not provide that protection while simultaneously leading armies across the galaxy. The Emperor created a new caste of Mechanicum tech priest specifically for this purpose. They were called the Unifiers, and their sole purpose was to construct new Webway tunnels for human use. These ad necta concilium worked tirelessly in the alien dimension, extending the human-built sections of the Webway under the Emperor's psychic protection, slowly connecting the Imperial Palace to the existing Eldar Webway network. And they made progress, real, tangible progress. The Imperial forces pushed through the newly constructed tunnels until they reached an abandoned Eldar city deep within the Webway. It was called Kalistar, though the Imperial forces who found it nicknamed it the Impossible City for its strange alien architecture and the way its dimensions seemed to defy conventional geometry. This derelict metropolis, built of the ancient psychic material called Wraithbone, represented the first major milestone of the Webway project. Humanity had reached the Webway proper. The dream was becoming real. But even as the project advanced, problems were mounting. Problems that the Emperor had anticipated, problems he had not anticipated, and problems that were being deliberately created by forces both within and without the Imperium. Let us talk about those problems. Because the story of the Webway project is not just a story of engineering and ambition. It is also a story of politics, betrayal, and the terrible consequences of keeping secrets from the people who needed to know them most. The first and most immediate problem was one of perception. When the Emperor returned to Terra and locked himself away in the Imperial dungeon, nobody outside a tiny circle of trusted advisors knew why. Not the Primarchs, not the generals of the Great Crusade, not the billions of soldiers fighting and dying in the Emperor's name. All they knew was that the Master of Mankind had abruptly abandoned the war effort at its most critical juncture and retreated to Terra for reasons he refused to explain. The Primarchs reacted to their father's sudden departure in different ways, and those reactions reveal the fault lines that the Horus heresy would later exploit. Imagine how it must have felt. You are a genetically engineered demigod, created by the most powerful being in the galaxy, to be a leader of armies and a conqueror of worlds. Your entire existence has been shaped by the desire to serve your father, to earn his approval, to prove yourself worthy of the incredible gifts he gave you. And then, at the moment of humanity's greatest triumph, at the pinnacle of the Great Crusade that has united the galaxy under a single banner, your father turns his back and walks away. Without explanation, without apology, without even the courtesy of a comforting lie. Some of the Primarchs accepted it with grace. Robert Guilliman, ever the pragmatist, threw himself into the work of building the administrative structures that the Imperium would need in peacetime. Rogel Dorn devoted himself to the fortification of Terra, trusting in his father's wisdom, even when that wisdom was silent. Vulcan continued his work among the people of Nocturne, his faith in the Emperor unshaken by the mystery of his seclusion. But others took it badly. Horus, despite the honor of being named War Master, felt the crushing weight of his father's expectations without the benefit of his father's presence. He was being asked to lead the greatest military campaign in human history without the guidance of the one being who truly understood what it was all about. Perturabo, already consumed by bitterness over perceived slights and favoritism, saw the Emperor's departure as confirmation of his deepest fear, that his father did not love him, had never loved him, and would never acknowledge his contributions. Angron, whose brain had been so badly damaged by the butcher's nails that he could process nothing that was not filtered through rage and pain, barely registered the Emperor's absence, except as another in a long chain of betrayals. And Lorgar, whose faith in the Emperor as a living god had been shattered by the destruction of the holy city of Monarchia, interpreted the Emperor's retreat as divine abandonment, the final proof that his father was not the god he had believed him to be. Each of these reactions was a crack in the Imperium's foundation, and the Chaos Gods, watching from the depths of the warp with patience measured in millennia, saw every crack, catalogued every grievance, and planned how to exploit them all when the time was right. The Horus heresy did not begin on Davin. It began in the silence between a father and his children. It began in the unspoken words that might have held everything together if only they had been spoken. The Webway project was the reason for that silence, and so, in a very real sense, the Webway project was the first domino that fell in the cascade that would bring the Imperium to its knees. He was a prisoner of his own ambition, trapped on the golden throne not by chains or walls, but by the simple mathematical reality that the project required his continuous attention. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Imagine being a Primarch, one of the Emperor's 20 demigod sons, created for the specific purpose of leading the Great Crusade, and suddenly your father simply walks away from the war without telling you why. Imagine being Horus, the newly appointed War Master, suddenly bearing the weight of the entire crusade on your shoulders, knowing that your father chose this moment to leave, and you do not know the reason. Imagine the doubt, the confusion, the resentment. This was not a minor issue. This was the seed of the Horus heresy. Not the only seed, certainly. The corruption of Horus was a complex process involving many factors, including the direct intervention of the Chaos Gods. But the Emperor's unexplained withdrawal from the crusade created a wound in the relationship between father and sons that the forces of chaos would later exploit with devastating effectiveness. And the Emperor knew this was a risk. He understood that his secrecy could cause problems. but he judged that the danger of revealing the project was greater than the danger of concealing it. And one of the primary reasons for that judgment was a threat that came from within the Imperium itself. The navigators. The Navis Nobilite, the great navigator houses, were one of the most powerful institutions in the Imperium. Their monopoly on warp travel gave them enormous political and economic leverage. Without navigators, ships could not traverse the warp safely. Without warp travel, the Imperium would collapse. The navigators knew this, and they used that knowledge to maintain a position of privilege and influence that no other non-military institution in the Imperium could match. Now consider what the Webway project meant for the navigators. If the Emperor succeeded, as if humanity gained access to the Webway as a means of interstellar travel, the navigators would become obsolete. Their monopoly would be shattered. Their power would evaporate. Their entire reason for existing would vanish overnight. The Emperor feared that if the navigators learned of the Webway project, they would rebel. They would use their control over warp travel to sabotage the Imperium, to hold entire sectors hostage, to undermine the project by any means necessary. And he was not wrong to be afraid. We know this because of what happened with Dark Glass. Dark Glass was a device similar to the Golden Throne, likely a prototype or a testing apparatus built by whoever created the original throne technology. The Emperor discovered it during the Great Crusade and set about restoring it as a secondary node in his planned Webway network. The research team was led by a navigator named Peter Hellion Akelu, an unparalleled genius who many had marked as a future Patanova, the supreme leader of all navigators. The irony was thick. Here was a navigator, one of the best who had ever lived, working diligently on a project that would render his entire species irrelevant. Achilleux understood what he was doing. He knew that the success of Dark Glass and the Golden Throne would mean the end of the navigator houses as a political force. But he worked on it anyway, because he believed in the Emperor's vision. Not everyone shared his conviction. The Patanova, the ruling leader of all the navigators, learned of Dark Glass despite the Emperor's secrecy. And he was terrified. The Patanova dispatched agents to sabotage the project, ordering one of Achilleux's own vassals, as a man named Vale, to destroy the station. As it happened, Vale never got the chance to carry out his mission. The Dark Glass station was located near a dangerous warp rift, called the Catalyst Warp Rift, and the proximity to that maelstrom of psychic energy drove much of the crew insane. A bloody mutiny erupted. As the station's crew slaughtered each other, Achilleux made a desperate attempt to activate Dark Glass's command throne, hoping to open a portal into the Webway and escape the carnage. The attempt killed him. The device was simply too powerful for a navigator to operate, even one as gifted as Achilleux. The Golden Throne would have required an even more powerful psyker than Achilleux to function as intended. Much more powerful. There were very few beings in the galaxy who possessed that level of psychic might. And the Emperor appears to have designed one of his Primarchs specifically for the task. The evidence strongly suggests that Magnus the Red, the Primarch of the Thousand Suns Legion, was created to sit upon the Golden Throne and serve as the living conduit between humanity and the Webway. Magnus, the one-eyed sorcerer king of Prospero, was the most psychically gifted of all the Primarchs. His abilities were staggering, eclipsing those of any other human psyker, save the Emperor himself. He could peer into the warp with an ease that made other psykers look like blind men groping in the dark. He could manipulate psychic energy with a precision and power that bordered on the divine. He was, in every meaningful sense, built for the task of operating the Golden Throne. But there was a problem. Magnus was also reckless. He was brilliant, but he was arrogant. He was powerful, but he was naive. He believed that he understood the warp better than anyone, that he could navigate its dangers with impunity, that the warnings of his father and his brothers about the risks of psychic power were the product of ignorance and fear rather than wisdom and experience. The Emperor had tried to warn Magnus. He had told him about the Webway, or at least hinted at it. He had told him that there was a delicate phase of the project that could not be disturbed. He had established the Edict of Nicaea, banning the use of sorcery in the Space Marine legions, in part to protect the Webway project from psychic interference. He had even placed enormous psychic wards around the Imperial Palace, or barriers of immense power designed to prevent any psychic intrusion from reaching the underground chambers where the Golden Throne and the Webway portal were housed. The Council of Nicaea itself deserves closer examination in the context of the Webway project, because it was not simply a theological debate about the morality of psychic power. It was a security measure, a deliberate, calculated act by the Emperor to minimize the risk of psychic interference with the Webway's delicate wards. The Council convened on the world of Nicaea in response to growing concerns about the use of psychic powers within the Space Marine legions. Several Primarchs, most notably Leman Russ of the Space Wolves and Mortarion of the Death Guard, had argued passionately that the use of sorcery was inherently dangerous and should be banned outright. Others, led by Magnus himself, argued with equal passion that psychic abilities were a tool to be understood and mastered, not feared and suppressed. The Emperor listened to both sides. He heard Russ's warnings about the corruption that psychic power could bring. He heard Mortarion's bitter testimony about the sorcerer tyrants who had enslaved his homeworld. And he heard Magnus's eloquent defense of the psychic arts, his impassioned argument that understanding the warp was the key to humanity's future evolution. In the end, the Emperor ruled against Magnus. The Edict of Nicaea banned the practice of sorcery within the Space Marine legions. Librarians, those specially trained psychers who served within each legion, were ordered to cease using their powers and return to the regular ranks. The study of the warp was declared off-limits, and any legion that continued to practice sorcery would face severe consequences. Magnus was devastated. He saw the edict as a personal betrayal, a rejection of everything he represented and everything he had spent his life studying. He returned to Prospero, consumed by bitterness and resentment, convinced that his father had sided with ignorance against knowledge, with fear against courage, with superstition against science. What Magnus did not know, what he could not have known, was that the edict was not about him. It was about the Webway. The Emperor had reached a critical phase of the project, a phase in which the psychic wards protecting the human-built sections of the Webway were at their most vulnerable. Any uncontrolled psychic activity in the vicinity of the palace, or any powerful psychic emanation that might attract the attention of warp entities to the project's location, represented a mortal threat to everything the Emperor had built. The Edict of Nicaea was, in essence, a quarantine. The Emperor was sealing off potential sources of psychic contamination, reducing the risk of accidental interference with the Webway's delicate psychic architecture. It was a blunt instrument, crude and painful, but the Emperor judged it necessary. He could not explain his reasons without revealing the project's existence, so he allowed the debate to proceed as a philosophical argument about the morality of sorcery, knowing that the true purpose of the edict would remain hidden. This is one of the most tragic aspects of the entire story. Magnus saw the Edict of Nicaea as proof that his father did not understand or appreciate his abilities. He saw it as evidence that the Emperor shared the same fear and prejudice that motivated his more conservative brothers. He felt rejected, marginalized, misunderstood, and that feeling of rejection was precisely what made him vulnerable to Tzeentch's manipulation when the time came. If the Emperor had explained the Webway project to Magnus, if he had told him about the critical phase, if he had said, "My son, I need you to stop using your powers for a few years because I am building something that your abilities could accidentally destroy," Magnus might have complied. He might have understood. He might have even offered to help, using his vast psychic talents to strengthen the wards rather than threaten them. The entire catastrophe might have been avoided, but the Emperor did not explain. He kept his secrets, as he always did, trusting in his own judgment and his own ability to control events. And Magnus, hurt and angry and increasingly isolated, retreated to Prospero and continued practicing the very arts that the edict had forbidden, convincing himself that he knew better than his father. that his mastery of the warp made him immune to the dangers that the edict was designed to prevent. He was wrong, and the galaxy has been paying the price for his wrongness ever since. But Magnus did not listen. Magnus never listened. And that, more than anything else, is why everything went wrong. Let us walk through the breach itself in detail, because it is the fulcrum on which the entire story turns. It is the moment where every thread of this narrative converges, where every mistake and every secret and every well-intentioned failure combines into a single, shattering catastrophe. The year was approximately 004 of the 31st millennium, though dates in the 40K universe are always somewhat unreliable. Horus, the greatest of the Primarchs, the Emperor's most trusted son, the War Master of the Imperium's armies, had been corrupted by the Chaos Gods during the events on Davin. Wounded in body and soul by an enchanted blade on the moon of Davin, Horus was taken to the Lodge of the Serpent by his own warriors, who sought to heal him through forbidden rituals. There, on the threshold between life and death, the Chaos Gods whispered to him. They showed him visions of a future where the Emperor would betray his sons, one where the Primarchs would be discarded once their usefulness was ended, where the Space Marines would be replaced by ordinary humans in the Emperor's grand design. These visions were lies, or at the very least, they were truths twisted beyond recognition. But Horus, weakened by his wound and manipulated by entities of incomprehensible cunning, believed them. When he awoke, he was no longer the Emperor's loyal war master. He was the enemy of everything he had once served. Magnus, far away on his homeworld of Prospero, saw all of this. His psychic abilities, the very abilities that the Edict of Nicaea had forbidden him to use, allowed him to perceive the corruption of his brother across the vast distances of space. He saw the tendrils of chaos wrapping around Horus's soul. He saw the future that would unfold if Horus's betrayal was not stopped. He saw the heresy, the death, the destruction, the fall of everything their father had built, and he panicked. Magnus loved the Emperor. Despite their disagreements, despite the pain of the Edict of Nicaea, despite the feeling of rejection that had driven him to ever greater acts of psychic defiance, Magnus still loved his father. He wanted to warn him. He needed to warn him. The fate of the Imperium depended on the Emperor learning about Horus's corruption before it was too late. But there was a problem. Prospero was far from Terra, incredibly far in terms of conventional communication. An astropathic message would take weeks or months to reach the Imperial Palace, and there was no guarantee it would arrive intact or be believed. Magnus could not afford to wait. At every moment of delay was a moment in which Horus's plans advanced, in which the conspiracy grew stronger, in which the noose tightened around the Imperium's neck. So Magnus did the one thing he should not have done. He used his psychic powers to reach across the galaxy in a single, massive projection. He gathered his strength, every ounce of psychic ability that he possessed, every technique that he had mastered during his decades of study, and he hurled his consciousness across the void toward Terra. But he was not strong enough. Magnus was the most powerful psyker in the galaxy other than the Emperor himself, but the distance was simply too great, the Emperor's wards too strong. His projection could not penetrate the barriers that the Emperor had erected around the palace, the very barriers that were designed to protect the Webway project from precisely this kind of psychic intrusion. And then Tsench appeared, the architect of fate, the lord of change, the chaos god of sorcery and manipulation, who had been watching Magnus for his entire life, who had been preparing this exact moment for millennia, offered Magnus a deal. Power. The power to break through the wards, the power to reach his father, the power to save the Imperium. Magnus took the deal. He was desperate. He was terrified. He was thinking only of his father and his brother, and the civilization that was about to be torn apart by treachery. He did not pause to consider why a chaos god would offer him help. He did not stop to think about what Tsench might gain from the arrangement. He simply reached out and took the power that was offered. And with that borrowed strength, he punched through the Emperor's wards like a fist through glass. The impact was catastrophic. But before we reach that catastrophe, we need to understand what was happening within the Webway itself, because the project was not proceeding smoothly even before Magnus destroyed it. The Emperor was facing challenges on multiple fronts, and the deeper his forces pushed into the alien dimension, the more dangerous those challenges became. The Eldar, the previous masters of the Webway, were not pleased by the Emperor's intrusion into their domain. When Imperial forces first entered the Webway through the Golden Throne's portal, the Eldar responded immediately. They began sealing portals that connected to their own craft worlds, cutting off potential routes of Imperial invasion. This was a defensive measure, but it also had the effect of limiting the Emperor's ability to expand the human Webway network. Every sealed portal was a dead end, a potential connection that would never be made. The Eldar reaction to the Emperor's Webway project is a fascinating study in the politics of a dying civilization. To the craft world Eldar, the Webway was not merely a transportation network. It was sacred. It was their inheritance from the Old Ones, the last great remnant of a galactic civilization that had shaped the destiny of every living species. The tunnels of the Webway were the veins and arteries of their culture, the pathways through which their seers traveled, their armies deployed, their people moved between the scattered remnants of their once mighty empire. To have a human, even one as powerful as the Emperor, attempt to claim ownership of the Webway was an affront of staggering proportions. It would be like a stranger walking into your ancestral home, declaring it his own, and beginning to renovate without permission. The Elder did not care about the Emperor's reasons. They did not care about his grand vision for humanity. They saw only an intruder in their most sacred space, a trespasser who was building crude imitations of their ancient architecture and protecting them with brute force psychic power rather than the elegant technologies that the Webway was designed to use. The craft world's seers, who detected the Imperial intrusion, were alarmed and offended in equal measure. They could sense the human-built sections of the Webway, and they could tell immediately that they were inferior to the original construction. However, where the Old One's tunnels were psychically self-sustaining, the human tunnels required constant external power. Where the original architecture was elegant and harmonious, the human additions were crude and functional, like a concrete extension bolted onto the side of a crystal cathedral. The Eldar could feel the strain that the Emperor's psychic maintenance was placing on the surrounding Webway structure, and they feared, correctly, that any failure in that maintenance would have catastrophic consequences, not just for the human sections, but for the adjacent original tunnels as well. Their response was swift and decisive. Sealed portals, collapsed tunnels, diverted pathways. The Eldar did not attack the Imperial forces directly, because that would have risked escalation into a conflict that neither side could afford. But they made it clear, through actions rather than words, that the human presence in the Webway was unwelcome, and that any further expansion would be resisted. The Harlequins, those enigmatic warriors who served the Laughing God and knew the Webway's secrets better than anyone, took a more nuanced approach. They watched. They observed. They sent their scouts through the tunnels adjacent to the human-built sections, studying the Emperor's work with the keen, analytical eye of beings who had spent millennia studying the Webway's architecture. And what they saw troubled them. The Harlequins understood something that the craft-world Eldar perhaps did not fully grasp. They understood that the Emperor's plan, if it succeeded, would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the galaxy. And a humanity connected through the Webway would be vastly more powerful than a humanity dependent on warp travel. The Webway would not just be a transportation network for the Imperium. It would be a weapon, a strategic asset of incalculable value, a force multiplier that would make the human species the dominant power in the galaxy beyond any hope of challenge. The Harlequins had seen the rise and fall of civilizations before. They had watched the Old Ones create the Webway and then perish. They had watched the Eldar inherit it and then nearly destroy themselves through decadence and pride. Now they watched humanity attempting to claim it, and they wondered whether the pattern would repeat, whether the Webway was ultimately a blessing or a curse, a ladder to ascension, or a trap that lured ambitious civilizations to their doom. Well, we will never know what the Harlequins would have done if the Emperor's project had progressed further. Whether they would have intervened to stop it, whether they would have offered to help, sharing their knowledge of the Webway in exchange for concessions from the Imperium, whether they would have simply continued to watch, as they had watched so many great events before, recording what happened for the performances that would tell the story to future generations. The fall of the Webway project rendered all such speculation moot. The breach, the demonic invasion, the war, the sealing of the portal, all of it happened too quickly for the Eldar to react in any meaningful way. By the time the full scope of the catastrophe became clear, the Webway was already flooded with demons and the human sections were beyond saving. The Eldar seers who detected the breach were horrified, not because they cared about the Emperor's project, but because the breach threatened the integrity of the Webway itself. Demonic incursions in the human-built tunnels could spread to the adjacent original sections, corrupting passages that had been safe for millions of years. The Eldar responded by sealing even more of their portals, cutting off entire sectors of the Webway to prevent the contamination from reaching their craft worlds. It was a drastic measure, but it was effective. The damage from the breach was largely contained within the human-built sections and the immediately adjacent tunnels. The irony is that the Eldars' defensive actions may have contributed to the project's ultimate failure. By sealing off so many pathways, they limited the options available to the Imperial forces fighting in the Webway, reducing their room to maneuver and making it harder to establish effective defensive positions. If the Eldar had left their portals open, the Custodes might have been able to use the additional routes to outflank the demonic hordes and slow their advance. But the Eldar were not thinking about the Imperial forces' tactical needs. They were thinking about their own survival. And in the calculus of a dying species fighting for its last remnants of power and territory, the Emperor's project was an acceptable sacrifice. But the Eldar were not the only inhabitants of the Webway. The labyrinth dimension was home to many things, some of them far more dangerous than the remnants of a fallen civilization. In the broken sections of the Webway, where the psychic walls had been damaged by the fall of the Eldar, or the ancient conflicts of the war in heaven, demons lurked. These were not the mindless, formless entities that drifted through the warp. These were predators, drawn to the Webway by the psychic energy that permeated its structure, waiting for any weakness they could exploit. And the human-built sections of the Webway were, by definition, weak. They lacked the inherent psychic resistance of the original tunnels. Only the Emperor's will, projected through the Golden Throne, kept them safe. And even the Emperor's will had limits. Every new tunnel that was built, every extension of the human Webway, stretched his psychic resources a little thinner. Every day that the project continued, the margin of safety grew a little smaller. This was the terrible paradox at the heart of the Webway project. The further they pushed, the more vulnerable they became. The more territory they claimed, the harder it was to hold. And the Emperor could not leave the Golden Throne to address problems personally, because the moment he left, the psychic shield protecting the new tunnels would collapse and the demons would pour in. He was a prisoner of his own ambition, trapped on the Golden Throne not by chains or walls, but by the simple mathematical reality that the project required his continuous attention. He could not delegate this task. There was no other psyker in the galaxy powerful enough to maintain the shield. Not yet. Not until the project was complete and the tunnels could be sealed with permanent psychic barriers. During one of the rare moments when conversation was possible, the Emperor shared a psychic musing with custodian Diocletian Koros that revealed something of his inner state during this period. When Diocletian asked about the origins of the Golden Throne, about whether the technology was the Emperor's own invention or something he had found and repurposed, the Emperor was characteristically evasive. He said that he either improved upon technology from the Dark Age of technology or possibly came up with the idea on his own, but he refused to give a definitive answer. This ambiguity is telling. The Emperor, a being who had lived for tens of thousands of years and who possessed knowledge that no other human could match, was either uncertain about the origins of his own most important device, or he was unwilling to share the truth. The distinction between the two possibilities matters. If the Emperor genuinely did not know where the Golden Throne came from, it suggests that the device predates even his memory, that it was created by a civilization so ancient and so advanced that even the Emperor could not fully comprehend its workings. If he did know and chose not to say, it suggests that the truth was either too dangerous to share or too complicated to explain. Either way, the Emperor's relationship with the Golden Throne was more complex than simple ownership. He was its master, but he was also, in some sense, its servant, bound to it by the demands of the project, unable to leave it for any significant period without risking everything he had built. The throne was simultaneously his greatest tool and his greatest constraint, yet the key to humanity's salvation and the chain that bound him to a single spot while his empire crumbled around him. There is a profound loneliness in that image. The most powerful being in human history, sitting alone in a dark chamber beneath a mountain, pouring his strength into a project that only a handful of people knew about, unable to participate in the great events unfolding above him, unable to guide his sons through the crises they were facing, unable to fight alongside his warriors as they conquered the stars in his name, unable to do anything except sit and work and hope that the world would not fall apart before he could finish. He could hear the whispers of the demons pressing against the tunnels. He could feel their malice, their hunger, their terrible patience. Every moment on the throne was a moment of combat, a silent war fought with psychic force instead of weapons, a war that no one could see and no one would remember. And while he fought that invisible war, his visible empire was slowly tearing itself apart. The Primarchs were growing restless, Horus was growing proud, the Chaos Gods were growing bold, and the Emperor sat on his throne, holding the tunnels together, watching it all happen through the limited awareness that the throne allowed him, knowing that he could not step away even for a moment without risking the entire project. And so the Emperor sat, year after year, month after month, day after day, alone with his burden, his vision, and the growing certainty that time was running out. Day after day, month after month, year after year, he sat on the Golden Throne in the depths of the Imperial dungeon, pouring his psychic power into the walls of the new Webway tunnels, while his Imperium fought and bled across the stars above him. He received reports. He issued orders through intermediaries. He communicated with Malcador and Rogel Dawn and Constantin Valdor through psychic projections and encrypted messages. But he could not leave. He could not fight. He could not lead. He could only wait and work and hope that the Great Crusade would hold together long enough for him to finish what he had started. It did not. Let us talk about what happened next. Let us talk about Magnus the Red and the moment that changed everything. The story of how Magnus destroyed the Webway project is one of the most tragic in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. It is a story about good intentions and terrible consequences, about the gap between knowledge and wisdom, and about the way the forces of chaos can turn even the noblest impulses into instruments of destruction. Magnus had been on Prospero, the homeworld of his Thousand Sons Legion, when he received a vision of the future. Through his extraordinary psychic abilities, he foresaw the corruption of Horus, the treachery of Erebus, and the beginning of the civil war that would tear the Imperium apart. He saw the War Master falling to chaos. He saw the Space Marine legions turning against each other. He saw the dream of human unity dissolving into blood and fire and madness. And he was terrified, not for himself, but for his father, for his brothers, for the Imperium that they had all sacrificed so much to build. He had to warn the Emperor. He had to tell his father what was coming before it was too late. But how? Yet the Emperor was locked away in the Imperial dungeon, behind psychic wards that even Magnus could not penetrate through normal means. Conventional astrotelepathy, the standard method of long-distance psychic communication, was too slow and too unreliable for a message of this importance. By the time an astropathic message reached Terra, It might be too late. Horus might have already made his move. The war might have already begun. First, Magnus attempted to psychically contact Horus directly, hoping to reach his brother before the corruption took hold. But he was too late. Horus had already been wounded by the Kinnebrach blade called the Anatheme on the world of Davin, and the warrior lodges had already begun their work of turning the War Master to chaos. Despairing, Magnus made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of eternity. He decided to use sorcery. Specifically, he decided to conduct a massive psychic ritual that would allow him to project his astral form all the way from Prospero to Terra, bypassing the normal limitations of astrotelepathy and delivering his warning directly to the Emperor in person. This was a violation of the Edict of Nicaea, the decree that had banned the use of sorcery in the Space Marine legions. Magnus knew this. He did not care. The stakes were too high for rules. The survival of the Imperium itself was at stake. The ritual was tremendous. Magnus gathered the greatest sorcerers of his legion and combined their power with his own, channeling an ocean of psychic energy into a single, focused projection. His astral form blazed through the warp like a comet, hurtling toward Terra at the speed of thought. And then he hit the Emperor's wards. The psychic barriers around the Imperial Palace were enormous, layered defenses designed to keep out exactly the kind of intrusion that Magnus was attempting. They were built not just to block casual psychic contact, but to withstand deliberate assault by the most powerful entities in the warp. The Emperor had constructed them with the explicit purpose of protecting the Webway project from psychic interference, and they were formidable. Magnus could not get through. His astral form crashed against the wards like a wave against a seawall, and for a terrible moment, he was stuck, trapped between the warp and the barriers, unable to go forward, unable to go back. And then, something whispered to him. An entity in the warp, an anonymous voice, sibilant and seductive, offering to help. As offering to provide additional power, enough power to breach the Emperor's wards and deliver the warning that Magnus so desperately needed to deliver. The entity did not identify itself. It did not need to. It was Tzeentch, the changer of ways, the architect of fate, the chaos god whose domain was sorcery and ambition and the manipulation of destiny. And Magnus, brilliant, arrogant, desperate Magnus, accepted the offer. The moment of acceptance was the moment everything ended. Not just for the Webway project, but for the dream of a unified humanity, for the hope of a galaxy free from chaos, for the future that the Emperor had been building for 10,000 years. In a single instant of desperation and pride, Magnus the Red sealed the fate of the human species. He would later be called the Crimson King, the Cyclops of Prospero. There's a dozen other names that ranged from the reverent to the contemptuous. But in that moment, he was just a son trying to reach his father, and the tragedy is that the attempt was born from love. With the combined power of his own psychic abilities and the treacherous gift of Tzeentch, Magnus smashed through the Emperor's wards like a fist through glass. His astral projection erupted into the Imperial Palace, a towering figure of psychic fire that crashed through layer after layer of protection until it reached the very heart of the Emperor's secret laboratory. Imagine what it must have looked like from the Emperor's perspective. He is sitting on the golden throne, pouring his psychic energy into the delicate infrastructure of the new Webway tunnels, maintaining the shields that keep the demons at bay, and performing the most demanding and precise psychic work that any being has ever attempted. And suddenly, without warning, an enormous psychic presence smashes through his defenses. Not a demon, not an enemy, his own son, a giant figure of blazing psychic fire, screaming a warning about Horus's betrayal, crashing through the very wards that are keeping the Webway safe. The Emperor must have understood what was happening even before the damage was done. He must have felt the wards fracturing, felt the psychic shields buckling under the impact of Magnus's astral form, felt the delicate web of psychic energy that he had spent years maintaining beginning to unravel. And he must have known, with the terrible clarity that comes from being the most powerful psyker in human history, that there was nothing he could do to stop it. And the wards were not just walls. They were the psychic infrastructure that protected the Webway project. The Emperor's defenses around the Imperial Palace were not separate from the psychic shield protecting the new Webway tunnels. They were the same thing, or rather, they were interconnected components of the same massive psychic architecture. When Magnus breached the wards, he did not just break a window in the Emperor's house. He tore a hole in the fabric of reality itself. The breach was catastrophic. The psychic barriers protecting the human-built sections of the Webway collapsed. The shields that had kept the demons at bay for years, maintained by the Emperor's constant, exhausting vigilance, shattered in an instant. And through those shattered shields, through the gaping wounds in the psychic fabric that Magnus had torn open, the demons poured in, millions of them, howling, screaming, gibbering hordes of Neverborn, entities of pure malice given temporary form by the chaotic energies of the warp. They flooded into the new Webway tunnels like water through a broken dam, slaughtering the Mechanicum workers who had been building the new passages, destroying the infrastructure that had taken years to construct, corrupting everything they touched with the foul taint of chaos. The Emperor felt every death. He felt the barriers collapse. He felt the demons surging through his life's work, destroying in seconds what had taken centuries to build. And he knew, in that terrible moment, that everything had changed. The project was not merely delayed. It was not merely damaged. It was in existential danger. If the demons were not stopped, must to choose. He could leave the Golden to choose. He could leave the Golden Throne, go to the breach, and try to seal it with his own power. But if he left the throne, the remaining psychic shields would collapse entirely, and the destruction would be complete. Or he could stay on the throne, maintain what remained of the shields, and trust others to fight the demons in his stead. He chose to stay. He poured every ounce of his remaining psychic strength into holding the portal, preventing the worst of the demonic incursion from reaching Terra. And he sent the only forces he could trust to fight the war. He could not fight himself. The Legio Custodes, the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal guard, as the 10,000, the mightiest warriors humanity had ever produced outside of the Primarchs themselves. And alongside them, the Sisters of Silence, the psychic blanks whose very presence was anathema to the warp and everything that dwelt within it. Together, these two forces descended into the Webway to fight a war that no one outside the Imperial Palace would ever know about. A war fought in the spaces between dimensions, in glowing tunnels that existed neither in the material universe nor in the warp. A war against enemies that no mortal army had ever been designed to face. The war within the Webway had begun. This is a conflict that deserves far more attention than it typically receives in discussions of the Horus heresy. While the great battles of the heresy, Istvan III and V, the Shadow Crusade, the Siege of Terra, occupy the spotlight, the war within the Webway was arguably the most consequential engagement of the entire Civil War, because this was not a fight over territory or political power. This was a fight for the future of the species, a fight that, if lost, would have ended humanity not with a bang, but with a howl, as demons poured through the portal beneath the Imperial Palace and consumed Terra from within. And it was fought entirely in secret. The billions of soldiers fighting the Horus heresy across the galaxy had no idea that another war was raging beneath their feet. The Primarchs who led the Loyalist forces did not know that their father was imprisoned on the Golden Throne, pouring his psychic strength into holding a portal shut, while his personal guard fought and died in a dimension that most humans did not even know existed. Yet the commanders who planned the defense of Terra did not know that the forces available to them had already been catastrophically depleted by a war they had never been told about. This secrecy had practical justifications. The Emperor could not reveal the existence of the Webway project without also revealing its failure, which would have devastated the morale of the defenders at a time when morale was already perilously fragile. And he could not send reinforcements into the Webway without revealing the portal's location, which was information that could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands under any circumstances. But the secrecy also had costs. Terrible costs. This secret conflict raged for 5 long years. 5 years of constant, unrelenting combat in the alien tunnels of the Webway, while above them, and on the surface of Terra, and across the breadth of the galaxy, the Horus heresy tore the Imperium apart. The irony was excruciating. 2 wars were being fought simultaneously, one public and one secret, and neither could spare resources for the other. The forces fighting the heresy did not know about the war in the Webway. The forces fighting in the Webway could not be redeployed to fight the heresy. And the Emperor was trapped at the center of both conflicts, holding the portal shut with his psychic power while his empire burned around him. The Imperial forces in the Webway established their primary defensive position around Kalastar, the abandoned Eldar city that had been nicknamed the Impossible City. Its ancient wraithbone construction provided some natural psychic resistance, making it a defensible position in a dimension where defensive positions were hard to come by. The Custodes, led by their tribunes, established a series of blockades across the Webway tunnels, creating killing grounds where they could channel the demonic hordes into concentrated kill zones. Behind these blockades, what remained of the Mechanicum workers tried desperately to repair the damaged sections of tunnel and seal the rifts that were allowing more demons to enter the Webway. It was grueling, thankless work, conducted under constant threat of attack, in an environment that was slowly driving many of the human workers insane. The Webway itself seemed to resist their efforts. The alien architecture of the original tunnels pulsed with energies that human instruments could not measure, and the damaged sections bled warp energy like open wounds, contaminating everything they touched with the taint of the Imperium. The Mechanicum workers who toiled in the Webway were among the unsung heroes of the entire conflict. These were not warriors. They were engineers, technicians, laborers, people whose skills lay in construction and maintenance rather than combat. And yet, they worked day after day in conditions that would have broken most soldiers, surrounded by the constant sound of battle, the screams of demons, the roar of bolt weapons, and the hiss of energy discharges. They worked knowing that at any moment, the blockade ahead of them might collapse, and a tide of demonic horror might sweep through their worksite. When they worked, knowing that the Custodes who protected them were dying at a rate that made their long-term survival statistically impossible. They worked anyway, because the Emperor needed them to, and because they believed, with the fervent faith of the Mechanicum, that the Omnissiah's will would see them through. Many of them did not make it. Daemon incursions that broke through the Custodes' defensive lines would sweep through the construction zones like wildfires, slaughtering the unprotected workers with casual brutality. The demons took particular delight in corrupting the Mechanicum's equipment, turning servitors against their masters, causing machines to malfunction in lethal ways. The human toll among the construction teams was catastrophic, and unlike the Custodes or the Sisters of Silence, as the Mechanicum workers could not be easily replaced. Each one lost represented months or years of specialized training, knowledge that could not be recovered. The Webway's environment also took a psychological toll that physical combat could not. The tunnels were alien, fundamentally alien, in ways that went beyond their strange geometry and otherworldly lighting. The very air had a quality to it that humans found deeply unsettling, a sense of wrongness that penetrated to the subconscious and refused to dissipate, no matter how long one was exposed to it. Some workers reported hearing whispers in languages that no human tongue could reproduce. Others experienced vivid hallucinations, seeing faces in the walls, hearing music that came from nowhere, feeling the touch of hands that were not there. Worse, the rates of mental breakdown among the Mechanicum teams were alarmingly high, and the few psychologists attached to the project found themselves entirely unequipped to deal with the unique forms of madness that the Webway produced. In front of the blockades, the Custodes and the Sisters of Silence launched counterattacks into the demon-held tunnels, trying to keep the enemy off balance and prevent them from massing for a decisive assault. These operations were masterpieces of tactical violence. The Custodes fought in the close confines of the Webway tunnels with a fluidity and precision that bordered on the artistic. Their guardian spears, those iconic weapons that combined a power blade with a built-in bolter, were perfectly suited to the environment, allowing them to engage enemies at both range and melee with devastating effect. While the tunnels channeled the fighting into tight corridors, where the Custodes' individual superiority could compensate for their numerical disadvantage, and every engagement was a lesson in controlled, purposeful destruction. The Sisters of Silence complemented the Custodes perfectly. Where the Custodes brought raw combat power, the Sisters brought psychic nullification. Their mere presence weakened the demons, disrupting the warp energy that gave the entities their form and power. In the narrow confines of the Webway tunnels, where the barrier between the material and the immaterial was thin to begin with, the Sisters' null aura was devastatingly effective. Lesser demons simply dissolved in their presence, their borrowed forms unable to maintain cohesion in the absence of the psychic energy that sustained them. Greater demons, those terrible entities that could normally shrug off bolt rounds and power weapons, found themselves diminished and vulnerable when the Sisters were near. Together, the Custodes and the Sisters of Silence formed the most effective anti-demon fighting force in the galaxy. They were the perfect weapon for the war they were fighting, and it is no exaggeration to say that without them, the Webway would have fallen within weeks rather than holding out for years. But even the perfect weapon has its limits, and the Custodes and the Sisters were being ground down by an enemy that had no limits at all. These operations were brutally effective. The Custodes were, individually, some of the finest warriors in the galaxy, each one a masterwork of genetic engineering and martial training that made even a space marine look crude by comparison. Oh, and the Sisters of Silence were the demon's worst nightmare. Beings whose psychic blankness actively suppressed the warp energy that gave the demons their form and power. In the presence of a Sister of Silence, demons weakened, flickered, and sometimes simply ceased to exist. But there were so many demons. The warp is infinite, and the entities that dwell within it are legion. For every demon the Custodes killed, 10 more poured through the rifts. For every tunnel the Mechanicum sealed, 3 more were breached. The war was a slow, grinding attrition, and the Imperial forces were losing. The situation deteriorated further when the forces of chaos began sending more than just demons. Corrupted space marines, warriors of the traitor legions, found their way into the Webway alongside the demonic hordes. Titan war engines, the colossal machines of death driven mad by chaos corruption, stalked through the wider tunnels. Greater demons, the most powerful servants of the dark gods, manifested among the ranks of the lesser entities, bringing with them a level of power that even the Custodes struggled to match. The Custodes were reduced by 90% during the course of the war. Let that number sink in. 9 out of every 10 custodians who entered the Webway did not return. These were not ordinary soldiers. These were the Emperor's personal guard, each one representing decades of investment in genetic modification, training, and equipment. Their loss was a blow that the Imperium would never fully recover from. The Sisters of Silence suffered proportionately devastating casualties as well. Janesha Kroll, but the Knight Commander of the Silent Sisterhood and possibly the most powerful psychic blank in human history, commanded the Sisters throughout much of the conflict. She was a figure of legend, a warrior whose very presence was so anathema to the warp that even the Custodes, who were highly resistant to the null aura of typical blanks, could barely perceive her. She fought with a ferocity and determination that inspired everyone around her, but even she could not turn the tide alone. 2 of the 3 commanding Custodes tribunes were killed during the fighting, leaving Tribune Ra Endymion as the primary Imperial officer in the Webway. Ra was a remarkable individual, even by the extraordinary standards of the Custodian Guard. He had been born on Terra during the Unification Wars, the son of Koja Zu, the minister of the Anuatan Steppes, us who had been executed by Captain General Constantin Valdor for the high crime of stealing Terra's last remaining ocean. Taken as a child by the Legio Custodes, Ra had risen through their ranks to become one of the Emperor's most trusted bodyguards, earning 871 personal names in honor of valorous deeds before the war in the Webway even began. Now Ra found himself in command of a failing defense, leading a shrinking army against an enemy that grew stronger with every passing day. The situation was desperate, and it was about to get much, much worse, because something was coming, something that the demons feared almost as much as they feared the Emperor himself, something born from the darkest moment in human history, from the very first act of deliberate, premeditated murder. Its name was Drachnyan. Drachnyan, at the end of empires, the echo of the first murder, the shard of madness. These were the titles whispered by the lesser demons, spoken in tones of terrified reverence. Of all the entities that dwelt in the warp, Drachnyan was perhaps the one most intimately connected to humanity, because it was born from humanity's original sin. In the ancient past, long before recorded history, when the ancestors of modern humans were still primitive creatures living in caves and hunting with sharpened sticks, one of them committed the first murder, not killing in self-defense, not killing for food, but deliberate, willful, premeditated killing of one human being by another, a brother killing a brother for reasons that were petty and selfish and utterly without justification. The dying scream of the victim, the primal cry of anguish and betrayal, echoed through reality and unreality alike. In the warp, where thoughts and emotions take physical form, that scream became something alive. The suffering of the murdered and the evil of the murderer crystallized into a being of pure malice, a demon that was tied to the very concept of human violence. Every murder committed by a human being since that first terrible act had strengthened Drachnyan. Every life taken in hatred or greed or spite fed its power. It was, in a very real sense, the embodiment of humanity's capacity for self-destruction, and it had been watching the Emperor for a very long time. Drachnyan appeared in the Webway during the final stages of the war, drawn by the tremendous psychic energy of the conflict and by its ancient obsession with the being it called the Anathema, the Emperor of mankind. Its arrival was heralded by a wave of terror that swept through the demonic ranks, not because they feared its wrath, but because they recognized what its presence meant. The game was changing. The stakes were being raised beyond anything the lesser entities could comprehend. The demon's first target was not the Imperial forces. It was the Archimandrite, the Mechanicum Dominus, who had been placed in command of the Tech Priest forces supporting the Custodes. Drachnyan possessed the Archimandrite's enormous mechanical body, turning the gigantic construct into a vessel for its malevolent intelligence. The possessed Archimandrite went on a rampage through the Imperial lines, destroying everything in its path with weapons that burned with warp fire and struck with the force of humanity's collective capacity for violence. The impossible city fell, but before it fell, one last desperate attempt was made to reinforce its defenders. Custodian Diocletian Koros was charged with securing reinforcements from Terra, but the secrecy of the project, the scarcity of resources consumed by the ongoing heresy, and the questionable loyalty of the Space Marine legions made this task nearly impossible. In the end, Diocletian assembled a force from the most unlikely sources imaginable. There were the doomed prisoners of House Viridian, a knight household that had briefly joined the traitor cause before recognizing their error and surrendering to imperial authorities. These disgraced warriors had been imprisoned on Terra, awaiting trial, when offered the chance to redeem themselves in a war that history would never record. They accepted without hesitation. Equipped with salvaged and captured knight armor, they marched through the Webway portal and into the worst fighting that the secret war had yet produced. There was also a crippled blood angel named Dominion Zephon, a warrior whose injuries should have ended his service, but whose determination to fight had not diminished. And there were Mechanicum servitors and Skitarii, machine soldiers, whose lack of independent consciousness made them resistant to the maddening influence of the Webway's corrupted tunnels. It was a ragtag force, scraped together from the margins of a dying Imperium, and it was hopelessly inadequate for the task at hand. But it was everything that could be spared, and those who composed it fought with a ferocity that belied their humble origins. House Viridian, in particular, as led her scions with desperate courage, knowing that they were fighting not just for the Emperor, but for their own redemption. The Emperor had left standing orders that anyone who entered the Webway, other than the Custodes, the Sisters of Silence, or the Mechanicum, was to be executed upon their return to real space. The knowledge of the Webway's existence was too dangerous to spread. What became of House Viridian after the war remains unknown. Their ultimate fate is one of the many tragedies buried in the shadows of the secret conflict. Despite these reinforcements, the impossible city could not hold. Kalistar, the ancient Eldar necropolis that had served as the Imperial forces' primary stronghold in the Webway, was overrun. The walls were shattered by warhound titans of the Legio Audax, traitor war engines that had been sent into the Webway by the forces of chaos. Brutal fighting raged for weeks as the Custodes and Sisters made their last stand amid the alien architecture. But it was not enough. The demonic hordes, now led by traitor space marines, corrupted titans, and the terrible presence of Drachnyen itself, drove the defenders back through the tunnels toward the portal that led to Terra. The retreat was a nightmare. Imperial forces fought running battles through corridors that warped and twisted around them, the damaged Webway itself seeming to conspire against them. The Mechanicum's Archimandrite, still possessed by Drachnyen, turned on the retreating Imperials, using her enormous mechanical form to attack the very forces she had been placed in command to protect. The betrayal was devastating, not because of the tactical damage it caused, but because it demonstrated something fundamental about the nature of the enemy they were facing. Chaos did not merely oppose the Imperium, it corrupted it, turned it against itself, used humanity's own strengths and institutions as weapons of its own destruction. The Imperial forces were pushed all the way back to the Webway gate that led to Terra itself. They were cornered, their backs against the portal, with an ocean of demons and traitors pressing in from every direction. If the gate fell, if the demons breached the portal and emerged into the Imperial palace, Terra itself would be overrun. The homeworld of humanity, on the beating heart of the Imperium, would be consumed by the warp. And then, at the darkest moment, when defeat seemed certain and hope had all but vanished, the Emperor acted. On Terra, the unspoken sanction was completed. 1,000 captured psychers, gathered by the black ships from across the galaxy, were sacrificed in a single, terrible act of mass execution. Their psychic death screams were channeled into the Golden Throne, providing just enough power to sustain the portal's seal for a single day, without the Emperor's direct presence. The unspoken sanction deserves a moment of reflection. 1,000 human beings, each with a name and a life, and a future that was erased, were burned alive to fuel a weapon. Some were convicted criminals, psychers who had been judged too dangerous to live free. Others were innocents, but people whose only crime was being born with a gift they never asked for. Some of them were barely more than children, young psychers gathered by the black ships before they had learned to control their abilities, brought to Terra in chains and fed into the Golden Throne like coal into a furnace. The Emperor did not hesitate. He did not mourn. He did not offer them comfort or explanation. He simply authorized the sanction and turned his attention to the battle that awaited him in the Webway. In his mind, the math was simple. 1,000 lives weighed against the billions who would die if the demons broke through to Terra. It was the same cold calculation that he had been making for tens of thousands of years. The same logic that had driven the Unification Wars, the Great Crusade, the creation of the Primarchs, and every other terrible decision that the Master of Mankind had ever made. But the unspoken sanction was also a precedent, the first mass sacrifice of psychers to sustain the Golden Throne. In the 10,000 years since that moment, the practice has become institutionalized. 1,000 psykers are sacrificed every single day, their souls consumed to power the Astronomicon and sustain the Emperor's failing body. The black ships travel the galaxy in a never-ending circuit, collecting the psychically gifted from every world in the Imperium and bringing them to Terra to be burned. It is the foundation upon which the entire Imperium rests, and it began here, in a moment of desperation during a secret war that almost no one knows about. One could argue that the Emperor had no choice, that the alternative was worse, and perhaps that is true. But it is also the argument that every tyrant in human history has used to justify every atrocity: the greater good, the lesser evil, the needs of the many. These are the phrases that civilizations use to excuse the things they do to their most vulnerable members, and the Imperium has been using them for 10,000 years. Free from the throne for the first time in years, the Emperor plunged into the Webway. He appeared as a burning dawn, a golden light that blazed through the alien tunnels with a fury that made the stars seem dim. The Emperor's psychic power, unleashed without the restraint that the Golden Throne had imposed upon it, manifested as a wave of golden fire that washed through the Webway and struck the demonic hordes like the fist of a god. The scale of the Emperor's intervention is difficult to convey in words. For years, he had been sitting on the Golden Throne, his power constrained and focused on the single task of maintaining the portal's seal. He had been like a river dammed, his vast psychic reserves building and building behind the wall of his concentration. Now, suddenly freed from the throne by Malkador's sacrifice, all of that pent-up power was released in a single, shattering instant. The tunnels of the Webway, designed to channel psychic energy, amplified his power even further. The Emperor's wrath flowed through the ancient architecture like water through a riverbed, following the pathways and conduits that the Old Ones had engineered millions of years ago. The wraithbone walls of Kalistar, those portions that still stood, resonated with his psychic frequency, adding their own stored energy to the conflagration. For a brief, terrible, glorious moment, the Emperor's power filled the Webway, like light filling a cathedral, and every demon within its reach was touched by that light. The demons screamed, they burned, they dissolved into the psychic conflagration like shadows before a spotlight. Lesser demons, those petty entities of malice and hunger that had swarmed through the breach in their millions, simply ceased to exist. Their borrowed forms could not withstand the concentrated fury of the most powerful psyker in human history. They flickered, shriveled, and vanished, their constituent energies scattered back into the warp like sparks from a dying fire. Even greater demons, those terrible lords of the warp, whose power normally rivaled that of small gods, were staggered by the Emperor's assault. Bloodthirsters, those towering demon princes of rage and violence, instant by a mind that could see through every deception and counter every stratagem. The demonic host reeled, and for the first time in 5 years of relentless advance, it retreated. The Emperor channeled his power into the very structure of the Webway, using the ancient architecture as a conduit for his wrath, turning the tunnels themselves into weapons. And he was not alone. The Emperor summoned an army of the dead. Psychic echoes of fallen warriors, wreathed in golden flame, rose from the ashes of the Webway's battlefields and joined the fight. The blazing avatars of fallen custodies appeared alongside their living brothers, fighting with a fury that transcended death. The betrayed dead of Istvan V, the Space Marines who had been slaughtered by their own brothers at the infamous drop site massacre, returned as burning specters to exact vengeance on the forces of chaos. And among them, towering above the rest, was a figure that witnesses described as a giant among giants, with great hands bared, the 10th son of a dying empire, briefly reborn in his father's immolating wrath. The exhausted custodes were reinvigorated by their master's presence. They fought with renewed fury, driving the demons back through the tunnels they had so recently conquered. For a brief, glorious moment, it seemed as though the tide had turned, as though the Emperor's power might be enough to reclaim the Webway and salvage the dream. But Drachnyen was not so easily defeated. The end of empires appeared before the Emperor in its true form, or as close to its true form as a being of pure concept could manifest in a physical dimension. It took the shape of the very first murderer, a Stone Age war chief wearing jewelry of bone and wielding a primitive spear. The first human to have willingly taken another human's life, the being whose act of primal evil had given birth to the demon in the first place. Drachnyen attacked the Emperor, and it wounded him. The demon's spear pierced the Emperor's golden armor, drawing blood that no weapon in the material universe could have drawn. The demon screamed its triumph, claiming that it would be the Emperor's end, that the anathema would fall before the echo of humanity's first sin. But the Emperor was not so easily killed. He seized the demon with his bare hands, forcing it to assume a new shape through sheer psychic force. Drachnyen fought the transformation, its essence writhing and screaming as the Emperor's will bent it into a form it did not choose. A sword, a blade of impossible sharpness, its surface covered with hundreds of tiny mouths that hungrily lapped at the divine blood flowing from the Emperor's wounds. The Emperor pulled the demon's sword from his own body. He could not destroy Drachnyen. The demon was too deeply tied to humanity itself, too fundamental to the nature of human violence to be unmade by any force, even the Emperor's. Killing it was not an option. Banishing it back to the warp would only be a temporary solution. Drachnyen would return, as it always returned, drawn by the endless tide of human murder that sustained its existence. So the Emperor made a different choice, a terrible, desperate choice. He called Endymion forward. The custodian tribune, the last surviving commander of the Imperial forces in the Webway, approached his master without hesitation. The Emperor spoke to Ra, sharing with him the full scope of his vision for humanity, the dream of the Webway, the hope that had been lost. He gave Ra something that he had given no one else: the truth, the complete, unvarnished truth about what the Webway project had been meant to accomplish and why its failure was so devastating. And then he rammed the demon sword into Ra's body. The blow was deliberate and precise, aimed to avoid vital organs. The Emperor was not trying to kill his loyal guardian. He was imprisoning Drachnyen within Ra's flesh, using the custodian's extraordinary physical and psychic resilience as a living cage for the demon. The sword vanished, absorbed into Ra's body, and Drachnyen was trapped. Still bleeding from his own wounds, the Emperor conjured a final beam of burning radiance and cleared the tunnel ahead of Ra. The golden light carved a path through the retreating demons, opening a corridor of safety that stretched deep into the Webway. "Run," the Emperor ordered, and Endymion, always the faithful guardian, always the loyal servant, turned on his heels and vanished into the Webway. He ran into the depths of the labyrinth dimension, carrying within his body the most dangerous demon that humanity had ever faced, fleeing into the infinite passages of the Webway so that the Emperor would not have to face Drachnyen again. He ran past the ruins of Kalistar, past the abandoned construction zones where Mechanicum workers had once toiled, past sections of the Webway that no human had ever seen before. He ran through corridors that glowed with alien light, through passages where the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, through junctions where a dozen pathways branched off in directions that defied geometric logic. And all the while, Drachnyen fought within him, screaming and clawing at the walls of its prison, showing Ra visions of the first murder, of every murder that had followed, of the endless parade of human violence that had given the demon its terrible power. Ra did not stop. He did not falter. He did not give in to despair, even as the demon whispered that resistance was pointless, that the darkness always won, that the only truth in the universe was violence. He ran because the Emperor had told him to run, and that was enough. It would always be enough. There is something profoundly moving about that image. A single warrior, alone in the depths of an alien dimension, carrying a demon of unimaginable power, running through corridors that stretched to infinity, driven by nothing but loyalty and duty and the stubborn human refusal to surrender. Ra-Endymion was, in that moment, the purest expression of everything the Emperor had hoped humanity could become. A being who chose to serve, who chose to sacrifice, who chose to endure suffering that no other being in the galaxy could have endured. Not because he was ordered to, but because he believed it was right. We do not know how far he went. The Webway's relationship with time is uncertain, and the corridors through which Ra fled may have stretched or compressed his experience in ways that defy conventional measurement. Perhaps he ran for years, perhaps decades, perhaps centuries. The Webway is infinite, and a man fleeing through its passages could run forever without reaching an end. He was never seen again. The Emperor's intervention had bought enough time for the surviving Imperial forces to evacuate the Webway. The last Custodes and Sisters of Silence retreated through the portal, battered and bloodied, but alive. The Mechanicum workers, those few who had survived the years of fighting, stumbled back into the Imperial dungeon with haunted eyes and trembling hands. And then the Emperor mounted the Golden Throne once more and sealed the portal shut. The Webway project was over. The dream was dead. 10,000 years of planning, centuries of construction, years of desperate warfare, all of it ended in that single, devastating moment. The portal that was supposed to have opened humanity's future instead became a threat that required the Emperor's eternal vigilance to contain. The Golden Throne that was supposed to have been a door became a prison, and the Emperor, who had planned to guide humanity into a golden age of psychic evolution and galactic unity, was instead chained to a machine for all eternity, pouring his strength into keeping the portal closed while the demons on the other side pressed endlessly against the seal. Think about the weight of that. Think about what it means. The Emperor did not end up on the Golden Throne because he lost a fight with Horus. That came later, and it made things worse, certainly. Shah to be sealed, and only the Emperor had the to be sealed, and only the Emperor had the power to seal it. Everything that followed, the siege of Terra, the duel with Horus aboard the vengeful spirit, Malcador's sacrifice, the Emperor's mortal wounding, and his internment on the life-sustaining mechanisms of the throne, all of that was consequence. The root cause, the original disaster, was the failure of the Webway project. When the Emperor decided to leave the throne and confront Horus, it was Malcador the Sigillite, his oldest and most trusted advisor, who took his place. Malcador was a psyker of extraordinary power, the second most powerful human psyker alive, but he was a candle next to the Emperor's sun. The strain of maintaining the portal's seal nearly killed him. By the time the Emperor's broken body was brought back to the Golden Throne, after the battle with Horus, Malcador was already dying. As the Emperor was placed back onto the throne, Malcador gave the last of his life force to sustain his master, crumbling to dust in a final, silent act of devotion. The Emperor has sat upon the Golden Throne ever since. 10,000 years and counting. His body decaying. His mind, they say, still active in the warp, still fighting, still holding the portal shut. 1,000 psykers are sacrificed to him every day, their life energies consumed to feed the throne's failing systems. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that makes warp travel possible, and is powered by this same terrible engine of mass sacrifice. Let us dwell on Malcador's final moments, because they represent one of the most quietly devastating scenes in the entire Horus Heresy saga, and they are inextricably linked to the Webway project and its failure. When the Emperor decided that he had to leave the Golden Throne and confront Horus aboard the vengeful spirit, he knew that someone would need to take his place. The portal beneath the palace was still a threat. The demons were still pressing against the seal. If the throne was left unattended, if there was no psychic presence maintaining the barrier, the portal would burst open and Terra would be consumed. There was only one person in the entire Imperium who could even attempt to fill the Emperor's role on the throne: Malcador the Sigillite, the Regent of Terra, the Emperor's closest companion for longer than anyone could remember. A psyker of extraordinary power, second only to the Emperor himself among unaugmented humans. A man who had dedicated his entire existence to the service of the Emperor's vision, who had sacrificed everything: his health, his relationships, his identity, his comfort, in pursuit of a dream that he understood better than anyone except the Emperor. Malcador knew what sitting on the throne would do to him. He had watched the Emperor's agonized expression for years as he maintained the psychic seal. He had felt the strain radiating from the throne, the terrible pressure of holding back an ocean of demonic malice, with nothing but willpower and psychic strength. He understood that his own power, vast as it was a fraction of the Emperor's. But maintaining the seal would be like trying to hold back a river with a single hand. It could be done, but not for long, and not without a price. He did it anyway, without hesitation, without complaint, without asking for reassurance or gratitude, or even acknowledgement. He simply walked to the throne, sat down, and took up the burden that his master was setting down. The pain must have been unimaginable. The golden throne was designed for the Emperor, calibrated to his psychic wavelength, built to channel his specific type of psychic energy into the portal's seal. Malcador's psychic signature was different, weaker, less perfectly attuned to the throne's mechanisms. Every moment he spent on the throne was a moment of excruciating psychic agony, his mind burning as it tried to produce the level of power that the seal demanded. And it was not just physical pain. The demons on the other side of the portal could sense the change. They could feel the difference between the Emperor's psychic presence and Malcador's. They knew that the seal was weaker now, that the being maintaining it was less powerful, less resilient. They pressed harder. They tested the barrier with renewed ferocity, hurling themselves against it with the mindless hunger of predators that smell blood. Malcador held. Somehow, he held. Through force of will and decades of training and an absolute, unshakable devotion to the Emperor and his dream, Malcador held the portal shut while the greatest battle in human history raged above him. He felt the Emperor leave the palace. He felt the battle on the vengeful spirit, the clash of father and son, the final confrontation between hope and despair. He felt the moment when Horus fell, and the moment when the Emperor was mortally wounded, and he held. When the Emperor's broken body was finally brought back to the Golden Throne, Malcador had been sitting on it for hours. In those hours, he had aged centuries. His body had been consumed by the effort, his flesh withering, his bones crumbling, his organs failing one by one under the strain of maintaining a psychic output that was never meant for a being of his limitations. He was barely alive, a husk of the man he had been, held together by nothing but stubbornness and love. As the Emperor was placed back onto the throne, Malcador gave the last of his life force to sustain his master. There was a transfer of power, a moment where the burden passed from one to the other, and in that moment, Malcador simply ceased to exist. His body did not die in the conventional sense. It dissolved. It crumbled to dust. The physical matter that had been Malcador the Sigillite, simply unable to maintain its cohesion without the psychic energy that had been sustaining it. In his final moments, the last flickers of his consciousness flowing into the Emperor's mind, Malcador the Sigillite ensured that the portal remained sealed, that the demons did not breach the barrier, that Terra did not fall. He gave his life, not in a blaze of glory on a battlefield, not in a dramatic last stand against a terrible enemy, but quietly, alone, sitting on a chair in a dark room beneath a mountain, holding a door shut. It was, perhaps, the most heroic act in the entire history of the Imperium, and almost no one knows about it. The connection between Malcador's sacrifice and the Webway project is direct and undeniable. If the project had not failed, if the portal had been sealed permanently rather than requiring continuous psychic maintenance, Malcador would not have needed to take the throne. He would have been available during the Siege of Terra to coordinate the defense, to advise the Primarchs, to use his formidable political skills and psychic abilities in the service of the Imperium's survival. His death was a direct consequence of the Webway project's failure, one more entry in the long ledger of costs that the catastrophe imposed on humanity. And the losses continued to accumulate long after the heresy ended. And beneath the Imperial Palace, behind the sealed doors of the Webway portal, the demons still press against the barrier, waiting, patient, eternal. Because demons do not tire, they do not give up, they do not forget. They are still there, still pushing against the seal, still hoping that one day the Emperor's strength will fail and the portal will open and they will pour through into the heart of humanity's homeworld. That is the legacy of the Webway project. Not a golden age of unity and progress, but a prison sentence of infinite duration. Not a pathway to the stars, but a wound in reality that can never be fully healed. Not the salvation of humanity, but the eternal damnation of its most powerful protector. And the worst part, the truly unbearable part, is knowing what could have been. If Magnus had not breached the wards, if the Emperor had told his sons the truth about what he was building, as if the Chaos Gods had not seen the threat that the Webway project represented and moved so ruthlessly to destroy it. If any one of 100 small decisions had gone differently, the galaxy we know, the grimdark nightmare of the 41st millennium, might never have come to pass. Humanity might have traveled the stars without fear. Communication might have been instantaneous. Trade might have flowed freely between every world in the Imperium. The navigator houses might have found new purpose in a changed galaxy. The Chaos Gods, starved of the psychic energy that gave them power, might have withered and faded into irrelevance. Psychers might have been embraced rather than feared, guided rather than burned. The human species might have evolved, under the Emperor's careful stewardship, into something truly magnificent instead. We got the age of the Imperium, the stagnation, the decay, the endless war, the superstition, the Inquisition, the black ships, the cycle of violence and suffering that has continued unbroken for 10,000 years. All because of one secret project, one moment of cosmic bad timing, one son who loved his father enough to destroy everything his father had built. Let us pause here and really consider what the completed Webway project would have looked like. Because so often we talk about its failure without fully appreciating the magnitude of what was lost. Let us dream for a moment, the dream that the Emperor dreamed. Let us imagine the galaxy that might have been. Picture a humanity that does not fear the stars. A civilization where you can step through a portal on Terra and emerge moments later. No astropaths burning out their minds to. No astropaths burning out their minds to send messages that might take months to arrive and might not arrive at all. Just doors. Doors that open onto everywhere, connecting every human world to every other human world in a web of instantaneous transit. The economic implications alone would be staggering. Trade routes that currently take months or years to traverse could be completed in minutes. Raw materials from one end of the galaxy could be processed and shipped to the other end without delay. The inefficiencies that plague the Imperium's economy, the lost shipments, the delayed communications, the worlds that go decades without contact because warp storms have cut them off from the wider Imperium. All of these would vanish overnight. The Imperium's GDP, if such a concept could even be applied to something so vast, would increase by orders of magnitude. The military implications would be equally transformative. Imagine being able to deploy a Space Marine chapter to any crisis point in the galaxy within hours rather than months. Imagine being able to coordinate campaigns across multiple sectors in real time, with commanders able to communicate instantaneously rather than relying on the glacially slow and unreliable channels of astropathic messaging. Imagine being able to evacuate a world under attack, moving its entire population to safety through Webway portals, rather than abandoning them to their fate because the nearest relief force is 3 months away by warp travel. The cultural implications would be profound as well. The Imperium's defining characteristic, more than its military might or its technological stagnation or its oppressive regime, is its isolation. Worlds are cut off from each other, not just by distance, but by the fundamental unreliability of the warp. Each planet is, to a significant degree, an island, connected to the wider Imperium by tenuous threads that can be severed at any moment by warp storms, demon incursions, or simple bad luck. This isolation breeds ignorance, suspicion, and parochialism. It makes it easy for worlds to fall into heresy or be conquered by aliens, because help is always far away and unreliable. The Webway would have ended that isolation. It would have created a truly connected human civilization for the first time in history. People on one world could have traveled to other worlds, experienced other cultures, shared ideas and innovations. The stagnation that has gripped the Imperium for 10 millennia, the reflexive conservatism that treats any change as heresy and any innovation as tech heresy, might never have taken hold in a society that was in constant, instantaneous contact with the full breadth of human experience. Think about what this would have meant for the ordinary citizen. The hive worker on Necromunda, who has never seen a sky that was not choked with pollution, could step through a portal and walk beneath the open stars of an agri-world. The farmer on some forgotten backwater, who has never met another human being, who was not born on the same continent, could travel to a forge world and see the wonders of human industry, or to a shrine world and witness the grandeur of the Imperium's spiritual heritage. He cared about their existence enough to build a doorway to their doorstep. The medical implications alone would have been revolutionary. Currently, the Imperium's medical technology varies wildly from world to world. Hive worlds often have access to advanced surgery and rejuvenate treatments, while frontier colonies might rely on little more than prayer and herbal remedies. The reason for this disparity is not a lack of technology, but a lack of distribution. The knowledge and equipment exist, but getting them to the worlds that need them requires warp travel, which is expensive, unreliable, and often impossible. With Webway access, our medical supplies and expertise could reach any world in the Imperium within hours. Plagues that currently devastate entire populations because treatment cannot arrive in time could be contained and eliminated before they spread beyond their initial outbreak. Genetic diseases that are endemic to certain worlds because those worlds have been isolated for too long could be addressed through cross-pollination with healthier gene pools from other systems. Life expectancy for the average citizen, which currently varies from as low as 15 years on the worst worlds to several centuries for the wealthy elite, could have been equalized to something approaching dignity. And education, knowledge, the free exchange of ideas between worlds separated by thousands of light years. In the current Imperium, innovation is treated as heresy, and a civilization that has been stagnant for millennia, a civilization that has been stagnant for 10,000 years, that has actually regressed in many areas of technology, that relies on machines and devices whose operating principles are no longer understood by anyone alive. A connected Imperium would have made such stagnation impossible. When knowledge flows freely, stagnation dies. When people from different worlds meet and exchange ideas, innovation follows as naturally as sunrise follows night. The Emperor's vision was not just about building tunnels. It was about creating the conditions for a second renaissance, as a flowering of human creativity and ingenuity that would have dwarfed anything in the species' history. All gone, all lost, all sacrificed on the altar of one moment's catastrophe, and perhaps most important of all, the psychic implications. The Emperor understood that humanity was evolving. Slowly, across millions of years, the human species was developing psychic abilities. The number of psykers born in each generation was growing. The strength of their abilities was increasing. This was not a disease or a corruption. It was a natural part of human evolution. The species reaching toward a new level of cognitive capability that would make it one of the most powerful psychic races in the galaxy. But this evolution was happening in an environment that was catastrophically unsuited to it. Though humanity was developing psychic abilities while still relying on the warp for travel and communication, which meant that every new psyker was also a potential gateway for demonic intrusion. Every child born with the gift of psychic sight was also a potential vector for chaos corruption. The Imperium's response to this problem, rounding up psykers on the black ships, burning the ones who could not be controlled, feeding the rest to the Emperor's failing machinery, was not a solution. It was a symptom of a disease that the Webway project was designed to cure. In a Webway-connected galaxy, psychic evolution could have proceeded safely. Psykers could have been trained and guided rather than feared and destroyed. The warp's influence could have been contained, its entities starved of the psychic sustenance they depended on. Then humanity could have evolved into a fully psychic species, not as victims of the chaos gods, but as their equals or their superiors. The Emperor envisioned a humanity that had mastered its own psychic potential, that could manipulate the warp without being consumed by it, that could stand alongside the Elder or even surpass them as masters of the immaterial realm. That was the dream. A golden age of human civilization unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. A humanity united, connected, evolving, ascending. A humanity free from the warp's corruption, free from the chaos god's predation, free from the endless cycle of violence and decay that has defined the Imperium since the Horus heresy. And it was all lost, all of it, because of one breached ward and one son who could not wait. Now, but let us also consider the role that chaos itself played in the destruction of the Webway project. Because while Magnus was the immediate agent of the catastrophe, the chaos gods were the ultimate architects of it. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, the architect of fate, was the one who provided Magnus with the power to breach the Emperor's wards. This was not a random act of mischief. It was a calculated strike against the single greatest threat to chaos's existence. The Webway project, if completed, would have severed humanity's connection to the warp. It would have starved the chaos gods of the psychic energy that sustained them. It would have ended their influence over the human species, removed their primary food source, and potentially led to their gradual diminishment and eventual death. The chaos gods could not allow that to happen. They had been watching the Webway project since its inception, probing its defenses, searching for weaknesses. They found one in Magnus. The Crimson King, with his insatiable curiosity and his arrogant belief that he could master the warp without being mastered by it, was the perfect instrument of destruction. Tzeentch did not need to corrupt Magnus or turn him to chaos. He merely needed to give him a push at the right moment, to offer him power when he was desperate enough to accept it, and let Magnus's own nature do the rest. The timing was exquisite. Magnus received his vision of Horus's corruption at exactly the moment when the Webway project was at its most vulnerable. The wards around the Imperial Palace were at their maximum extension, stretched thin by the growing network of new Webway tunnels, whilst the Emperor was locked on the Golden Throne, unable to respond to any crisis that did not directly threaten the portal. And Magnus, the one Primarch who might have been trusted with the truth about the project, had been kept in the dark precisely because the Emperor feared his recklessness. Every factor aligned perfectly for catastrophe. The Emperor's secrecy, Magnus's arrogance, Tzeentch's manipulation, the timing of Horus's corruption, the vulnerability of the wards, the Emperor's imprisonment on the throne. Each one was a necessary condition for the disaster, and all of them came together in a single, devastating moment. Was it fate? Was it the work of the Chaos Gods, orchestrating events across millennia to ensure that their greatest enemy's greatest project would fail at the worst possible moment? Or was it simply the universe's indifference, the cold mathematics of probability catching up with a plan that depended on too many things going right? In the Warhammer 40,000 universe, the answer is probably both. The Chaos Gods are real, and they do manipulate events on a cosmic scale. But they also exploit existing weaknesses, amplify existing flaws, turn existing doubts and fears into instruments of destruction. They did not create the Emperor's tendency towards secrecy. They did not create Magnus's arrogance. They did not create the political tensions within the Imperium or the emotional wounds that festered in the Primarchs' hearts. They simply saw these weaknesses and pressed on them hard at exactly the right moment. The destruction of the Webway project was not a single act of sabotage, or it was the culmination of 1,000 small failures, each one insignificant on its own, each one fatal in combination. The Emperor failed to trust his sons. Magnus failed to listen to his father. The navigators failed to set aside their self-interest. The Chaos Gods failed to fail. And in the gap between what could have been and what was, an entire galaxy fell into darkness. Let us now turn our attention to what happened after the sealing of the portal. Because the story of the Webway project is not just a story about technology and warfare. It is a story about what happens when absolute power meets absolute secrecy, and the terrible consequences that follow when the people who need to know the truth are kept in the dark. The Emperor's decision to keep the Webway project secret was, in his view, perfectly rational. And there were genuine threats that justified the secrecy. The navigators, as we have discussed, had both the motive and the means to sabotage the project. The Eldar would have opposed it. The Chaos Gods would have moved against it even earlier than they did. And the Primarchs, some of whom the Emperor already suspected were vulnerable to corruption, might have been compromised if they had possessed knowledge of the project's existence and purpose. But the Emperor's rationality was cold rationality, mathematical rationality, the kind of rationality that treats people as variables in an equation rather than as thinking, feeling beings with their own needs and motivations. He calculated the risks of secrecy and judged them acceptable. He calculated the risks of disclosure and judged them unacceptable. And he made his decision. What he failed to account for was the human factor, not in the sense of error or incompetence, but in the sense of emotion, of trust, of the relationship between a father and his sons. When the Emperor left the Great Crusade and returned to Terra without explanation, he created a vacuum of trust. His sons, the Primarchs, had been taught to revere their father, to follow his commands without question, to believe that he always acted with wisdom and purpose. But they were also beings of tremendous ego and ambition, demigods who craved their father's approval and felt his absence as a personal wound. Horus, in particular, was devastated. The newly appointed War Master had been given the greatest responsibility in the Imperium, the command of the entire Great Crusade. And yet his father had walked away at the very moment when that responsibility was at its heaviest. The message, whether intended or not, was clear. Whatever the Emperor was doing on Terra was more important than the Crusade, more important than the wars being fought in his name, more important than Horus himself. That wound festered, and the forces of chaos, which understood the human heart far better than the Emperor seemed to, knew exactly how to exploit it. If the Emperor had told Horus about the Webway project, would it have changed anything? We cannot know for certain, but it might have. Knowing that his father had returned to Terra for a specific, vitally important reason, rather than simply abandoning the crusade out of disinterest, it might have given Horus the emotional anchor he needed to resist the corruption that was being aimed at him. It might have given him something to hold on to during those dark moments when the whispers of chaos were loudest. And if the Emperor had told Magnus, if he had explained, in clear and unambiguous terms, that the Webway project existed, that it was being protected by psychic wards of tremendous delicacy, and that any psychic intrusion of sufficient power could destroy it, would Magnus have still performed his catastrophic ritual? Almost certainly not. Magnus was reckless, yes. Arrogant, yes. But he loved his father, and he would not have deliberately destroyed the most important project in human history. The Emperor's secrecy did not just fail to prevent the disaster. It caused the disaster. Every terrible thing that happened, from the breach of the Webway wards, to the war within the Webway, to the Emperor's eternal imprisonment on the Golden Throne, can be traced back to the decision to keep the Webway project secret from the people who needed to know about it most. This is not to absolve Magnus of responsibility. He was warned, in general terms, not to use sorcery. He was told that there were forces at work that he did not understand. He chose to ignore those warnings, and the consequences of his choice were catastrophic. But the blame is shared, and the Emperor's portion of it is not small. There is a deeper irony here too. The Emperor kept the Webway project secret because he feared the consequences of disclosure. He feared that the navigators would rebel. He feared that the Eldar would interfere. He feared that the Chaos Gods would act. But by keeping the project secret, he ensured that the consequences of its failure were far worse than any of those feared outcomes could have been. If the navigators had rebelled, the Emperor could have defeated them. He had the military force to crush any internal insurrection. If the Eldar had interfered, he could have fought them off or negotiated with them. If the Chaos Gods had moved against the project earlier, he might have been better prepared to defend it, with the full resources of the Imperium mobilized for its protection, rather than scattered across the galaxy, fighting a crusade that he had been forced to entrust to others. Instead, he got the worst possible outcome: a catastrophic breach that he could not repair, a war that he could not win, and a prison sentence that he cannot escape. It's all because he trusted no one with his most important secret. The Webway project stands as the ultimate cautionary tale in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. It demonstrates that even the most brilliant mind, even the most powerful being, can make mistakes that echo through the ages. It shows that secrecy, even well-intentioned secrecy, can be more destructive than any weapon. And it reminds us that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Both the Emperor's intention to save humanity and Magnus's intention to warn his father of danger. Let us now turn our attention to what happened after the sealing of the portal. Because the failure of the Webway project did not just affect the Emperor, it had consequences that rippled outward through the entire Imperium, shaping the galaxy we know in ways that are both obvious and subtle. Yet the most immediate consequence was the loss of the Custodian Guard as a fighting force. The war in the Webway had consumed 90% of the Custodes, reducing the Emperor's personal guard from a formidable army to a skeletal garrison. When the siege of Terra began, when Horus brought his traitor legions to the very walls of the Imperial Palace, the Custodes were a shadow of what they had been. The warriors who remained were veterans of a war that no one outside the palace knew about, hardened by years of fighting in conditions that would have broken any lesser force. But there were simply too few of them to make the difference that they might otherwise have made. Each custodian who fell in the Webway represented decades of investment. Unlike Space Marines, or who could be produced in batches through relatively standardized gene seed implantation, each custodian was a unique creation. The process of making a custodian began in infancy. The candidates selected based on genetic markers that were understood by only a handful of the Emperor's most trusted gene rights. The modifications were not bolted onto an existing human framework, as they were with Space Marines, but woven into the very fabric of the candidate's being, altering them at the cellular level until the boundary between the original human and the engineered superhuman became impossible to define. This individualized creation process meant that every custodian was irreplaceable. When a Space Marine chapter lost warriors, it could recruit new aspirants and begin the implantation process, on producing new battle brothers within a matter of years. When the Custodes lost warriors, the knowledge and craftsmanship that had created them was diminished. The gene rights who understood the process were few, their methods closely guarded secrets that could not be easily taught or replicated. To lose 9 out of 10 custodians was not just to lose 9 out of 10 warriors. It was to lose 9 out of 10 masterworks, each one a testament to the Emperor's own genetic artistry, each one carrying within their modified DNA the echoes of the Master's handiwork. The psychological toll on the survivors was equally devastating. These were warriors who had been conditioned from birth to believe in the Emperor's infallibility, to trust in his plan, to accept that their service was part of a grand design that would ultimately triumph. What they saw in the Webway challenged those beliefs in ways that no amount of psycho-conditioning could have prepared them for. They saw the Emperor struggle. They saw him fail. They saw his greatest project crumble around him, saw his rage and his desperation as the tunnels he had built were consumed by the very forces he had sought to protect humanity from. And they saw their brothers die, hundreds and then thousands of them, in a war that seemed to have no end and no purpose beyond delay. When the surviving custodians emerged from the Webway, they were changed. Not corrupted, not weakened, but fundamentally altered in their understanding of what they served and why. The certainty that had defined them was replaced by something more nuanced, more complex, perhaps even more human. But they continued to serve the Emperor with absolute loyalty, but the nature of that loyalty had shifted. It was no longer the unquestioning devotion of warriors who believed their master could do no wrong. It was the mature loyalty of warriors who had seen their master's failures and chosen to serve him anyway, not because he was perfect, but because the alternative was unthinkable. This shift in the Custodes' character would have profound implications for the next 10,000 years. After the heresy, after the Emperor was interred upon the Golden Throne, the Custodes retreated into the Imperial Palace and largely withdrew from galactic affairs. For millennia, they rarely left Terra, rarely engaged in the wars that raged across the Imperium. Many interpreted this as arrogance or indifference, but the truth was more complex. But the Custodes were guarding the sealed portal. They were watching the barrier that kept the demons at bay. They were fulfilling the last duty that the Webway War had imposed upon them, a vigil that could never end. Consider, if the Webway project had not failed, if the Custodes had been at full strength when Horus attacked, the siege of Terra might have gone very differently. The 10,000 at full strength would have been a force multiplier of tremendous proportions. Their presence on the walls of the palace might have held back the traitor legions long enough for loyalist reinforcements to arrive. The Emperor might never have needed to confront Horus personally. The entire endgame of the heresy might have played out differently. But the Custodes were depleted. They fought magnificently during the siege, as they always did. But they were fighting with a fraction of their numbers. The war that nobody remembered had already bled them dry before the war that everybody remembers had even begun. The Sisters of Silence suffered similarly. Their losses in the Webway were devastating, and the organization never fully recovered. After the heresy, many of the surviving sisters were folded into the League of Black Ships and disappeared from the battlefield. The rest, disagreeing with the direction the Imperium was taking under the High Lord's rule, disbanded as an official organization. The most powerful anti-demon force in the Imperium's arsenal was effectively dismantled, its remnants scattered across the galaxy, its institutional knowledge lost. Janicia Kroll, the Knight Commander who had led the Sisters through the worst of the Webway fighting, and survived the war in the Labyrinth dimension, though she lost several fingers in the retreat from Kalistar. She would die during the siege of Terra itself, killed by the World Eater Khan the Betrayer, during the defense of the Eternity Wall spaceport. Her death was unceremonious. Khan, in his blood-mad rampage, barely noticed the kill. His kill counter simply went up by 1. So ended one of the Imperium's greatest heroes, unknown and unremembered by the very civilization she had given her life to protect. The loss of the Webway project also had profound implications for the Imperium's relationship with technology. The project represented the cutting edge of human technological ambition, an attempt to achieve something that no human civilization had ever accomplished. Its failure reinforced the growing conservatism within the Mechanicum, forced the belief that technology was a matter of faith rather than innovation, that the mysteries of the machine were sacred and not to be questioned or improved upon. The tech priests who had worked on the project, those who survived, were sworn to secrecy. Their knowledge was sealed away, their experience wasted, and the Imperium's capacity for technological progress, already declining, took another step backward. In the millennia that followed, the Golden Throne itself began to fail. The device that had been designed to open a door to the Webway was now serving a purpose for which it had never been intended, keeping the door shut while simultaneously sustaining the Emperor's life and powering the Astronomicon. It was being held together by faith and duct tape, metaphorically speaking, and the Mechanicum's ability to maintain it was limited by their incomplete understanding of how it worked. By the 36th millennium, the throne's deterioration had reached a critical point. The number of psychers required to feed its systems had increased dramatically, and the black ships were dispatched with greater frequency and urgency to gather sacrificial psychers from across the galaxy. 4 times the original number of psychers were being consumed daily by the 41st millennium, their life energies burned away to sustain the failing mechanisms of a device that should never have been used in this way. The Mechanicum eventually became desperate enough to seek outside help. They launched an expedition into the Webway itself, battling through harlequins and demons to reach Komorrach, the dark city of the Drukhari. There, what would provide the technical expertise needed to repair the throne, or at least delay its collapse. The bargain was a devil's deal in every sense. The Dark Eldar gained something they had long desired, a golden throne of their own, which they could use to address the demonic incursions that had been plaguing Komorrach with increasing frequency since the formation of the Great Rift. And the Mechanicum gained, at best, a few more centuries of functionality for the original throne. It was a temporary fix, a bandage on a mortal wound, bought with the lives of billions of innocents. But what choice did they have? The alternative was the collapse of the Golden Throne, the death of the Emperor, and the subsequent opening of the Webway portal beneath the Imperial Palace. If that happened, Terra would fall. The Astronomicon would go dark. Warp travel would become impossible, and the Imperium, already staggering under the weight of endless war and internal decay, would shatter into a billion isolated fragments, each one easy prey for the myriad enemies that waited in the darkness between the stars. The Webway project, even in failure, continues to shape the destiny of the Imperium. It is the reason the Emperor sits on the Golden Throne. It is the reason the throne requires such tremendous sacrifice to maintain. It is the reason the Imperium is perpetually on the brink of collapse, sustained by a device that is slowly, inexorably failing. The dream of the Webway, the dream of a humanity united and free from the warp. It is the dream that died so that the nightmare of the 41st millennium could live. And in the 42nd millennium, that nightmare has grown darker still. The formation of the Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, has torn the galaxy in two, creating a permanent wound in reality that stretches from the Eye of Terror to the eastern fringe. Warp travel, already dangerous and unreliable, has become nearly impossible in many regions. Whole sectors of the Imperium have been cut off, plunged into a darkness called the Imperium Nihilus, where the light of the Astronomicon cannot reach, and the forces of chaos run rampant. If the Webway project had succeeded, the Great Rift would have been an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. Humanity would not have been dependent on warp travel, would not have needed the Astronomicon to navigate, or would not have been vulnerable to the disruptions in the Immaterium that the Rift has caused. The worlds of the Imperium Nihilus would still be connected to the rest of humanity through the Webway, still supplied, still defended, still part of a unified civilization. Instead, billions are dying. Worlds are falling to chaos, to Xenos invasion, to simple starvation and societal collapse. The Imperium is fracturing along lines that would never have existed in a Webway-connected galaxy. And the forces arrayed against humanity, the Chaos Gods, the Necrons, the Tyranids, the Orcs, the Drukhari, are exploiting the division with ruthless efficiency. The Webway itself has not fared much better. The Great Rift has intensified the demonic presence within its broken sections, or is making travel through the labyrinth dimension even more dangerous than before. The Drukhari of Komorrach have been hit particularly hard. Kana's Gate, the great seal that kept the most dangerous section of the Webway walled off from the Dark City, was nearly breached during the disjunction caused by the awakening of Ivrain and the partial manifestation of Inead, the Eldar god of the dead. The Dark City was plunged into chaos, its supreme overlord Asdrubael Vect forced to retreat to his outposts, while demonic incursions erupted throughout Comarruc's countless subrealms. The Elder of the Craft Worlds, those distant descendants of the civilization that originally mastered the Webway, have also felt the impact. Their seers report that the Webway is becoming increasingly unstable, its ancient infrastructure crumbling under the strain of the Great Rift's psychic pressure. Passages that have been safe for millennia are now collapsing or being breached by demonic entities. The Harlequins, whose mastery of the Webway is unmatched, speak of growing darkness in the deepest tunnels, of things moving in the spaces between dimensions that were not there before. And the Necrons, those ancient enemies of the Old Ones who first built the Webway, continue to punch their way into the labyrinth dimension through their dolmen gates. These crude portals lack the elegance of the original Webway gates, and they damage the tunnel walls every time they are activated, creating new vulnerabilities that demons can exploit. The Necrons do not care about the damage they cause. They have no souls, no psychic presence, and therefore no vulnerability to the entities of the warp. The Webway is simply a convenient tool for them, a faster way to move their slow-moving tomb fleets across the galaxy. That their use of it contributes to its ongoing deterioration is of no consequence to beings who measure their plans in millions of years. So the Webway crumbles. Slowly, incrementally, almost imperceptibly, the greatest feat of engineering in the history of the galaxy is falling apart. The Old Ones who built it are long dead. The Eldar who inherited it are a dying species, scattered and diminished. The Emperor who tried to claim it for humanity is imprisoned on his failing throne. And no one, not the Mechanicum with their prayers and their incense, not the Eldar with their seers and their wraithbone, not the Necrons with their incomprehensible technology, each can repair the damage that millennia of war and neglect have inflicted. One day, perhaps, the Webway will be nothing more than a memory, a network of dead tunnels, collapsed and empty, haunted by the echoes of the civilizations that once traveled through them. And when that day comes, the galaxy will be a lonelier place, a place where the distances between stars are truly impassable, where every world is an island in a sea of darkness, where the dream of connection and unity that the Old Ones first envisioned and the Emperor tried to reclaim will be forgotten entirely. But that day has not come yet. The Webway still exists. It is still there, beyond the sealed portal beneath the Imperial Palace, beyond the Webway gates that dot the surfaces of 1,000 worlds, beyond the hidden passages that the Harlequins guard with their lives. As it is broken and dangerous, and haunted by things that should not exist, but it is still there. And as long as it exists, the dream is not entirely dead. Perhaps, somewhere in the galaxy, someone will find a way to rebuild what was lost. Perhaps the Emperor, if he ever rises from his throne, will resume the work that was interrupted 10,000 years ago. Perhaps the Eldar, in their desperate quest to save their dying species, will forge an alliance with humanity that allows both races to share the Webway's remaining resources. Perhaps some new technology, some new understanding of psychic engineering will provide the means to replicate the Old One's original materials and repair the damage that has been done. These are slim hopes, which are barely worth mentioning in a galaxy that runs on suffering and where optimism is a luxury that few can afford. But they are hopes nonetheless, and in the grim darkness of the far future, even the faintest hope has value. There is one more element of this story that deserves exploration. One more thread in the web of consequences that leads from the Emperor's secret laboratory to the galaxy we know today. And that is the question of what the Webway project tells us about the Emperor himself. Throughout the long history of the Imperium, the Emperor has been many things to many people. A god, a tyrant, a savior, a deceiver, a father, a monster, a beacon of hope, a crushing weight of expectation. He is all of these things, and none of them, depending on who you ask and when you ask them. But the Webway project reveals something about the Emperor that none of his other works can quite match. It reveals that he was afraid, not afraid of battle, not afraid of death, not afraid of the enemies that threatened humanity from every direction. The Emperor feared the warp. He feared what it did to humanity, what it would do to humanity if left unchecked. He understood, better than anyone who had ever lived, that the relationship between humanity and the warp was fundamentally unsustainable. That as long as humans relied on the warp for travel and communication, they would be vulnerable to its corruption. That the Chaos Gods, those terrible entities born from the collective psychic emanations of all sentient life, would never stop trying to consume and corrupt the human species as long as that connection existed.
But the Webway project was not just an engineering challenge. It was an attempt to sever a relationship that the Emperor believed would eventually destroy humanity if it was allowed to continue. It was a defensive measure, the ultimate defensive measure, an attempt to build a wall between humanity and the forces that sought to devour it from within. And the fact that it failed, that the wall was never completed, that the relationship between humanity and the warp remains as dangerous and destructive as ever, that is perhaps the greatest tragedy in all of Warhammer 40,000. Because the Emperor was right, the warp is destroying humanity, slowly but surely. The Chaos Gods are growing stronger. The Great Rift has torn the galaxy in two. Psychic mutations are becoming more common, and with them demonic possessions, warp storms,
and all the other nightmares that the Emperor tried so desperately to prevent. The Webway project was humanity's best chance to escape this fate, and it was destroyed not by the forces of chaos themselves, but by the very secrecy and distrust that the Emperor employed to protect it. The tragedy is not just that the project failed. The tragedy is that it failed in a way that validated every fear the Emperor had about the warp and its influence on humanity, while simultaneously demonstrating that his own response to those fears was flawed. He tried to save humanity from the warp by hiding in a dungeon and keeping secrets from his own sons. And the warp used those secrets and that hiding to destroy the very salvation he was building. There is a final irony, a last bitter twist in the tale that brings us full circle. Remember Ra-Endymion, Ishur the custodian tribune who carried Drachnion into the depths of the Webway at the Emperor's command. Remember how he ran into the labyrinth dimension, carrying the echo of the first murder within his body, and was never seen again. Drachnion was eventually freed. Somehow, at some point in the millennia that followed, the demon escaped its prison within Ra's body. Perhaps Ra finally fell. Perhaps the custodian's extraordinary constitution eventually gave out under the strain of containing a being of such immense malevolence. We do not know the specifics. What we do know is that Drachnion ended up beneath the Tower of Silence on the demon world of Uralan, where the Chaos Gods themselves lock away their most dangerous secrets. And it was there that Abaddon the Despoiler found it. Abaddon, the War Master of Chaos, or the most dangerous enemy of the Imperium in the 10,000 years since the Horus Heresy, led his first Black Crusade in 781 of the 31st Millennium. During that campaign, he was drawn to the Tower of Silence by whispers in the warp, guided through its labyrinthine depths by a towering figure bathed in golden light. This mysterious guide, whose identity remains uncertain, led Abaddon directly to the imprisoned daemon and then vanished without explanation. Abaddon claimed Drachnion for himself. The daemon, which had once been wielded as a weapon by the Emperor, now served the Emperor's greatest enemy. It became Abaddon's most feared weapon, a blade that could cut through reality itself, that could flay the souls from those it struck, as that consumed everything in its path with an appetite born from tens of thousands of years of human violence. The weapon that the Emperor had briefly held, the demon that he had imprisoned within his most loyal servant, was turned against everything he had ever built. The great circle of betrayal and failure closed, and Drachnyen, the end of empires, found a new hand to wield it. With Drachnyen at his side, Abaddon hewed open the gates of the Cromarch's citadel. He disrupted nullification fields. He impaled the great technomandrite of Danth, sealing the fate of an entire star cluster. Each act of violence committed with the blade fed its power, strengthened its connection to the primal darkness that gave it birth. Every death inflicted by Drachnyen echoed through the warp, a reminder that the first murder had never truly ended, and that it continued in every act of violence that followed it, and that the demon born from that act was still hungry. It is deeply ironic and deeply tragic that the Emperor's attempt to contain Drachnyen ultimately provided the Chaos Gods with one of their most potent weapons. The demon that the Emperor fought in the depths of the Webway, that he imprisoned in the body of his most trusted guardian, that he sent running into the infinite corridors of the labyrinth dimension, ended up in the hands of the being who would do more damage to the Imperium than any other enemy in the 10 millennia since the heresy. One cannot help but wonder what the Emperor thinks about this, if he thinks at all, in his current state. Does he know that Drachnyen is free? Does he know that it serves Abaddon? Does he remember the moment in the Webway when he drove the demon's sword into Ra-Endymion's body and ordered his loyal guardian to run? Does he regret that decision, or does he accept it as one more price paid in the endless war between order and chaos, one more sacrifice in a conflict that has no end and no winner? We will probably never know, and somewhere in the vast darkness of the void, if you listen very carefully, you can almost hear the echo of a custodian's footsteps, still running through the empty corridors of a dimension that exists between worlds, still carrying out his master's last order, still faithful, even in the depths of infinity, and somewhere in the depths of the warp, where time has no meaning and irony is the only constant, the Chaos Gods laughed. So where does this leave us? What can we take away from the story of the Terran Webway, the most secret project in Warhammer 40,000? Perhaps the most important lesson is about the nature of hope in the grimdark universe. The Webway project was hope incarnate. It was the single greatest expression of optimism in the entire history of the Imperium. A plan that assumed humanity could do better, could be better, could transcend the limitations and dangers that had plagued it since the dawn of consciousness. It was a plan that said, we do not have to live this way. We do not have to be afraid of the dark. We can build a pathway to the light. And the fact that it failed, the fact that hope was crushed so thoroughly and so completely, is what gives the Warhammer 40,000 setting its distinctive character. The Imperium is not merely a civilization at war, and it is a civilization that had a chance at salvation and lost it. It is not merely struggling against external enemies, it is haunted by the ghost of what it might have been. Every psyker burned at the stake, every ship lost in the warp, every world consumed by chaos, is a reminder of the future that was stolen. A future where none of those horrors would have been necessary. That is the genius of the Webway project as a piece of storytelling. It is not just a piece of background lore. It is the foundation of the entire setting's emotional architecture. It is the reason that the grimdark future feels tragic rather than merely bleak. Because there was a chance, there was a way out, and it was lost. The Webway still exists, of course. The Eldar still use it, or what remains of it. The Harlequins dance through its broken corridors, and keeping its secrets. The Dark Eldar lurk in Komorrah, that impossible city-state that sprawls across the Webway's nodes like a malignant growth. The Necrons punch through its walls with their dolmen gates, using it for their own purposes with characteristically mechanical indifference. The dolmen gates are a particularly galling development for the Eldar. While the Emperor at least attempted to build his own sections of the Webway, expanding the network rather than simply parasitizing it, the Necrons take a far more brutal approach. Their dolmen gate technology literally tears holes in the Webway's walls, creating temporary portals that allow Necron forces to enter and traverse the tunnels before exiting through another violent breach. Each use of a dolmen gate damages the surrounding webway architecture, our weakening walls that have endured for millions of years and creating vulnerabilities that demons and other predators can exploit. The Necrons do not care about this damage. They do not care about the webway's long-term integrity or the consequences of their actions for its other inhabitants. The Necrons were ancient when the webway was young, and they regard the entire labyrinth dimension as an inconvenience at best, a useful shortcut that they are entitled to use however they see fit. Their relationship with the webway is purely transactional, devoid of the reverence that the Eldar feel or the ambition that the Emperor showed. They use it, they damage it, and they move on without a backward glance. This ongoing Necron intrusion adds another layer of urgency to the webway's deteriorating state. One, the damage from the Emperor's failed project, combined with the ongoing Necron incursions, the spreading influence of the Great Rift, and the natural entropy that affects even the most durable structures over millions of years, means that the webway is slowly dying. Tunnels that have been stable since the War in Heaven are collapsing. Portals that once connected distant parts of the galaxy are failing. The network that the old ones built to unite the stars is fraying at the edges, and no one has the knowledge or the power to repair it. There is also the matter of the Black Library. Hidden somewhere within the deepest, most protected section of the webway, guarded by the Harlequins, with a zealotry that exceeds even the custodian's devotion to the Emperor, the Black Library is said to contain the sum total of all knowledge about chaos, every demon's true name, every ritual of binding and banishment, every weakness, every vulnerability, every secret that the Chaos Gods have tried to hide. It is the single most dangerous repository of information in the galaxy, and it exists within the webway because the webway is the one place where such knowledge can be kept safe from the entities it describes. The Black Library is also rumored to contain a complete map of the webway, an ancient Imperial artifact known as the Atlas Infernal, an organic, adaptable map whose pages were created from the stretched skin of an untouchable, a psychic blank whose null nature made the pages resistant to warp interference. The veins and capillaries visible on the pages can reconfigure themselves to show the reader any desired destination within the webway, and constantly adjusting to reflect the labyrinth dimension's ever-changing topology. The Atlas was reportedly created before the Horus Heresy, which means it may contain information about the human-built sections of the webway that the Emperor constructed, information that no one in the Imperium currently possesses. If such a map were to fall into the hands of someone with the knowledge and resources to use it, it could, theoretically, provide the foundation for a renewed attempt at the Webway project. The map would show where the original tunnels are still intact, where the damaged sections might be repaired, where new connections could be established. It would be, in essence, a blueprint for the resurrection of the Emperor's dream. But the Harlequins guard the Black Library with their lives, and they do not share its contents with outsiders. The few humans who have reportedly gained access to the library, most notably the Inquisitor Bronislaw Chevak, paid terrible prices for the privilege and were profoundly changed by the experience. The Harlequins have their own plans for the future of the galaxy, and those plans do not necessarily align with humanity's interests. And beneath the Imperial Palace, behind a sealed portal that no one dares to open, the demons still wait. They press against the barrier, testing its strength, probing for weaknesses. They have been waiting for 10,000 years, and they will wait 10,000 more. Because they know something that the Imperium has forgotten. They know that the Golden Throne is failing, that the psychers who feed it are growing scarcer, but that the technology that sustains it is crumbling. They know that one day the seal will break, and on that day, the war that began in the tunnels beneath the Imperial Palace will resume, and this time there will be no emperor to stop it. That is the shadow that hangs over the Imperium. That is the doom that whispers in the dark corners of the Imperial Palace, where the tech priests tend to the Golden Throne with prayers and incense,
and the desperate hope that their machine god will endure for just a little longer. That is the inheritance of the Webway project. Not a golden age, but a ticking clock. Not salvation, but a stay of execution. And that is why the Terran Webway deserves to be remembered. Not just as a piece of lore, not just as a plot point in the Horus Heresy, but as the moment when everything changed. The moment when humanity's future was decided, not on a battlefield or in a throne room, but in a secret laboratory beneath a mountain, by a being who tried to save everyone and ended up saving no one. The Emperor sits on his golden throne, and the demons press against the seal, and the galaxy burns. And in the silence between the screams, if you listen very carefully, you can almost hear the echo of a dream that died 10,000 years ago. A dream of glowing tunnels connecting distant stars. A dream of a humanity united and free. A dream of a door that opened onto everything wonderful and possible. A door that is now, and perhaps forever, closed. But closed does not mean forgotten, and forgotten does not mean gone. In the archives of the Imperium, buried under layers of classification and sealed behind wards of both psychic and physical nature, fragments of the truth about the Webway project survive. The Custodian Guard, those few who survived the war in the labyrinth dimension, carry the memory in their genetically enhanced minds. They do not speak of it openly. They do not share what they know with outsiders. But they remember, and when they stand watch over the Emperor's withered form in the Sanctum Imperialis, when they patrol the corridors of the Imperial Palace with weapons that can cut through reality itself, they remember what lies beneath their feet. They remember the sealed portal. They remember the demons pressing against its wards. They remember the brothers they lost in tunnels that glowed with alien light. The Mechanicum, or the Adeptus Mechanicus, as it has since become, also retains fragments of knowledge about the project. The unifiers who built the new Webway tunnels are long dead, but their records survive in encrypted data vaults accessible only to the most senior tech priests. These records are incomplete, heavily redacted, and often contradictory. The tech priests who study them do so with the reverence of monks examining Holy Scripture, seeking not understanding, but confirmation of their faith in the Omnissiah's divine plan. And then there are the Harlequins, those mysterious warrior dancers, servants of the laughing god Segarak, who know the Webway better than any other living beings. They know what the Emperor attempted. They know how close he came to succeeding. And they know, perhaps better than anyone else in the galaxy, what was lost when the project failed. The Harlequins have their own relationship with the truth about the Webway. They perform plays that tell the story of the fall, of the war in heaven, of the rise and decline of the Eldar Empire. Some of these performances touch on the Emperor's attempt to claim the Webway, though the details are filtered through the lens of Eldar mythology and the Harlequins' own inscrutable purposes. What they think about the Emperor's project, whether they view it as hubris or admiration, as a threat or an opportunity, is known only to them and to the laughing god they serve. There are even rumors, unconfirmed and likely unconfirmable, that certain factions within the Eldar have considered approaching the Imperium about a renewed attempt at the Webway project. The Inari, but that radical faction dedicated to the resurrection of the Eldar death god, Inead, have already demonstrated a willingness to work with humanity. Ivrain, the herald of Inead, played a crucial role in the resurrection of the Primarch Robut Guilliman, and the alliance between the Inari and the forces of the Imperium has survived the initial mistrust and political complications that accompanied it. Could such an alliance extend to the Webway? Could Eldar expertise in the labyrinth dimension, combined with human resources and the Emperor's residual psychic power, be used to reopen the sealed portal and resume the project that was interrupted 10,000 years ago? It is a tantalizing possibility, but it remains, for now, nothing more than speculation. One of the most heartbreaking consequences of the Webway project's failure was the fate of the Sisters of Silence. These remarkable women, the Anathema Psychana, the Witch Seekers, were among the most crucial assets in the war within the Webway. and among the most overlooked heroes of the entire Horus Heresy era. Their story deserves a moment of reflection before we close this chapter of galactic history. The Sisters of Silence were blanks, also called pariahs or untouchables. They were humans born with a rare genetic trait that made them psychic nulls, beings who existed as holes in the fabric of the warp. Where psykers generated and manipulated warp energy, the Sisters absorbed and nullified it. Their very presence was anathema to anything that drew power from the Imperium, which made them uniquely lethal against demons. In the Webway, their value was incalculable. Every sister who stood in a tunnel corridor was a wall against the daemonic tide, a zone of reality where the laws of physics reasserted themselves and the nightmare creatures of the warp lost their grip on material existence. The demons feared the sisters in a way they feared nothing else. A custodian could destroy a demon's physical form, but the demon would simply reform in the warp and return. A Sister of Silence could unmake a demon at a fundamental level, disrupting the psychic matrix that gave it existence and scattering its essence into incoherence. The cost of this effectiveness was terrible. The sisters fought and died in the Webway alongside the custodies, their smaller, more fragile human bodies taking punishment that no amount of training could fully prepare them for. That they could not be interred in dreadnought sarcophagi when they fell. They could not be revived by apothecaries using gene seed technology. When a Sister of Silence died, she was simply gone, and the genetic quirk that made her a blank could not be reliably reproduced in future generations. Each sister who fell was a loss that could never be fully replaced. After the Webway War ended and the Siege of Terra consumed the Imperium's attention, the Sisters of Silence were gradually marginalized. The order that had once stood alongside the Custodian Guard as one of the Emperor's most trusted institutions was slowly disbanded, its members scattered across the galaxy on various assignments that took them further and further from the halls of power. The political dynamics of the post-heresy Imperium, dominated by the newly powerful ecclesiarchy and the Inquisition, had little room for an organization of psychic nulls, whose very existence was unsettling to the psykers, who now served in virtually every branch of imperial government. It was not until the return of Robert Guillemot in the 41st Millennium that the Sisters of Silence were reconstituted as a formal order and returned to their rightful place alongside the Custodian Guard. Guillemot, who understood better than most the value of what had been lost, made the restoration of the Sisters one of his early priorities. But 10,000 years of neglect had taken its toll. The order that existed in the 41st Millennium was a shadow of what it had been during the Great Crusade, diminished in numbers, equipment, and institutional knowledge. The Sisters' fate is a microcosm of everything that went wrong after the Webway project failed. An institution of extraordinary value, purpose-built for a specific and vital role, allowed to wither and decay because the project it was designed to serve no longer existed. The Sisters of Silence were not just warriors. They were a component of the Emperor's grand design, pieces of a puzzle that was never completed. Without the Webway project to give their existence context, they became anomalies, relics of a purpose that no one fully understood. The practical obstacles are enormous. The original project required the Emperor's personal, continuous psychic attention to maintain the human-built sections of the Webway. The Emperor, in his current state, is already stretched to the limits of his power maintaining the portal seal, powering the Astronomicon, and fighting the endless psychic war against the forces of chaos in the Imperium. Asking him to do more, to resume the Webway project on top of everything else, seems like asking a drowning man to also juggle. The resources do not exist. The technology does not exist. The political will does not exist. And yet, the Webway is still there. The portal is still beneath the palace. The Golden Throne, despite its deterioration, is still functional. And the dream of a connected humanity, free from the warp's corruption, is still alive in the minds of those few who know about it. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps, in a universe where hope is the scarcest resource of all, the mere existence of the possibility is worth preserving.
Perhaps the day will come when the Emperor rises from his throne. Oh, when Magnus is redeemed, when the breach is healed, and the tunnels are restored, and the dream can begin again. Perhaps one day, a human being will step through a portal on Terra and emerge on a world a galaxy away, and will look up at alien stars with wonder rather than fear, and will know that the darkness has been beaten at last. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the Webway will continue to crumble. Perhaps the Golden Throne will fail. Perhaps the demons will break through. Perhaps the dream will be forgotten entirely, buried under 10,000 more years of war and suffering and decay, until even the custodian guard no longer remembers what lies beneath the floors they patrol. In the grim darkness of the far future, either outcome is equally possible. And that is what makes the story of the Webway project so compelling. It is not just a story about the past, it is a story about the future, about the choices that still lie ahead, about the possibility, however slim, that things could get better, and about the equally real possibility that they will get worse. The Terran Webway is the Imperium's greatest what-if. Its most painful could have been. Its most devastating almost was. It is the proof that the Emperor had a plan, that he was working towards something, that the endless wars and the brutal authoritarianism and the staggering human cost of the Imperium's existence were not pointless cruelty, but steps toward a goal that would have justified all of it. And it is also the proof that even the best plans can fail, that even the most powerful beings can be undone by their own flaws, that the gap between ambition and achievement can swallow civilizations whole. That is the story of the Terran Webway, the most secret project in Warhammer 40,000, the greatest tragedy in the history of the Imperium, the dream that died so that the nightmare could live. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this journey into the darkest corners of Warhammer 40K lore, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Every subscriber helps us keep exploring the grim darkness of the far future together. And if you have thoughts on what the Emperor should have done differently, or what might have happened if the Webway project had succeeded, leave them in the comments below. I would love to hear your perspective. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And remember, even in the darkest of futures, there was once a dream of light. Hold on to that.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.